There are nights when the mind forgets how to stop moving. When you lie awake and feel, somewhere beneath the thoughts and the replaying and the wondering, a strange kind of homesickness, not for any house you once lived in, but for something quieter than that. Something steadier. A place inside yourself that feels, somehow, safe. If that is tonight for you, you have found the right companion for these hours. This video offers contemplative stories drawn from Buddhist wisdom across many centuries and traditions: Theravada, Japanese Zen, Chinese Chan, Korean Seon, Tibetan, and Vietnamese. They are offered for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic guidance, but as one hand extended in the dark, from those who sat with this same restlessness long before us. Tonight, we journey towards something the great teachers across Asia called by different names refuge, true home, inner sanctuary. Not a place you build, not a place you travel to, but the one place that was always beneath the searching. You don't need to stay awake for any of this. The wisdom travels through you whether your eyes are open or closed. So let everything begin to slow now. Feel the weight of the bed beneath you, its solidity, its warmth. Let your shoulders soften just a little. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands rest open or closed, whichever feels like rest. Take one breath, just one, and let it carry you. You are already home more than you know. She had not slept in 4 days. Her name was Kamala, and she lived on the edge of a large trading town called Savati, in the northeastern kingdom of Kosala, in the time when the monsoon rains were late and the river had pulled itself down to its bones. This was 25 centuries ago, in the land that is now northern India, where the summer dust rose in great slow curtains across the plains, and the mango trees threw what shade they could over the cracked, pale earth, and the air by afternoon was so heavy and still it felt like something pressing against the skin. Savati was a prosperous town, in the ordinary way of prosperous towns, the wealthy in their walled compounds near the center, the middle traders in their solid houses along the main lanes, and the rest of the population fanning outward toward the edges where the buildings grew simpler and the alleys narrower, and the smell of the river was always present. It was on one of these outer lanes that Kamala had made her life. In a house of 3 small rooms with a packed earth floor and a courtyard barely large enough for a single fig tree, which she had planted herself 7 years ago as a kind of quiet act of faith that she would still be here when it grew, that roots and patience were worthwhile things. She sold dyed cloth at the market, deep saffrons, muted terracottas, colors that moved in the light like the last hour before sunset. She had a reputation among the market women for honest measure when Kamala said a length was 3 arm spans. It was 3 arm spans, not 2 3/4 with a fold to disguise the difference. She rose before dawn to prepare her stall, walked home at dusk, cooked a simple meal, and each evening before dark she sat for a few minutes under the fig tree in the courtyard and let the day go. These were small ceremonies, and they had kept her. She had a daughter named Chanda, 8 years old, who slept each night, curled on the mat beside her mother, like a seed waiting for the right season. Chanda had her father's eyes, a thoughtful, unhurried darkness that seemed, even in a child, to be looking at something just beneath the visible surface of things. Kamala's husband, Nanda, had died 2 years before, not quickly, not cleanly, a long diminishing, a slow retreat from the life they had built together, until one morning she woke and the breathing beside her had stopped, and the absence was so total it seemed impossible that the room could still hold its shape around it. She had learned, in those 2 years, a particular kind of sufficiency, She did not call it strength. She called it necessity. You do what must be done, and then you do it again the next morning. And you do not stop to ask whether you have the reserves for it, because the asking only drains the reserves faster. There was Chanda's hair to comb, and the cloth to dye, and the stall to set up, and the customers to treat well. And these demands were not cruel, they were, in fact, a mercy. They kept her anchored in the forward motion of days. But 4 days without sleep had done something to her. It was the fever in the quarter that had started it. A fever that moved through the poorer districts of Savati like a slow fire, taking children first 3 from families Kamala knew by name, children she had watched run through the alley outside her window. It had not taken Chanda, but the possibility had moved into the house and made itself at home in every room, standing in the corner when she cooked, sitting at the edge of the mat when she tried to sleep. Each night, she lay awake with her hand resting near her daughter's back, monitoring the rhythm of her breathing, the way a sailor monitors weather, not constantly, but with a part of the mind that never fully rests, always reading the signals, always preparing for what might shift. By the 4th night, she was beyond tiredness. She existed in that particular state that comes only after extreme sleeplessness, a bright, glassy alertness that is not wakefulness, but a kind of thinning, as if the wall between the self and everything else has worn down to gauze. Her thoughts moved strangely, circling the same territory again and again without arriving anywhere. She thought of Nanda. She thought of the 3 children in the alley. She thought of the cloth unsold, the money that would run short if the fever kept customers from the market. She thought of how alone she was. Not in any dramatic way. She had neighbors. She had nodding acquaintances. She had the women at the adjacent stalls, but alone in the specific way of a person who, when the night is very dark and the fear is very present, has no one to reach for in the dark beside her. Only her daughter, whose breathing she was monitoring. Only herself. She did not know exactly when she moved from the mat to the floor. She found herself there, sitting upright with her back against the wall and her palms pressed flat against the packed earth, not sure what she was reaching toward. Some anchor, some ground that would not give. Her heart was beating too fast. The darkness in the room felt absolute, and the thoughts kept circling, and the fear was enormous and sourceless, not fear of one specific thing any longer, but a kind of background terror that the world was fundamentally unsafe, that there was nothing solid enough to hold her, that she had been fooling herself all these years with her honest cloth measure and her fig tree and her morning rituals, that there was no actual ground beneath any of it. She pressed her palms harder against the floor. And then she remembered something. She had heard the bhikkhus speak at the market's edge on many mornings. The monks in their saffron robes who came through Savati with their alms bowls at dawn, accepting whatever was offered without preference. And sometimes, not always, only when it seemed welcome, pausing to say a few words to anyone who wished to listen. She had stood at the edge of these small gatherings, often from the distance of her cloth stall, close enough to hear, but not close enough to be seen as one of the seekers. She had told herself she was merely resting between customers, but she had listened. One of the elder bhikkhus, a man with a shaved head and the kind of face that had been through enough of life to have lost all performance, had said something she had carried without quite knowing she was carrying it. He had said that the ancient words of refuge were among the oldest continuously spoken words in human history, that people had said them in this same region for more than 10 generations of grandmothers, that kings had said them, and beggars had said them, and women selling cloth at dawn had said them, that the words did not belong to any rank or status, that they were in the monk's quiet and completely unfussy way of saying it. Available. She remembered the words themselves. She had heard them recited at the temple on feast days, had heard the monks say them before teachings, had heard them sung by other women in the lane on certain mornings without entirely understanding. 3 sentences, each spoken 3 times. And the monk, she could not remember his name or his face precisely, only the quality of his voice, which was neither warm nor cold, but simply steady, like a lamp in still air, had explained what they meant. He had said something she had not expected. He had said that the original Pali, the ancient language in which the words first lived, did not actually say, "I take refuge." He had said that the literal meaning, the meaning underneath the translation, was something different. It was, "I will undertake to find my home." Kamala sat with her palms on the floor and felt those words move through her. "I will undertake to find my home. In the Buddha, in the Dhamma, in the Sangha." She said them, not loudly. Chanda was sleeping 2 feet away and the night was very still. But she said them, more breath than voice. The way you say the most important things when there is no one to say them to except the darkness and whatever is in it that might be listening. Buddham saranam gacchami. I will undertake to find my home in the Buddha. As she said it, she thought of what she knew of the Buddha, not mythology, not the elaborated stories that accumulated around great figures over time, but the plain fact of him that the bhikkhus always came back to. He was a human being. That was the central fact. Not a god born perfect and untouchable in the heavens. A person. He had been born into a body that could be frightened. He had known the particular anguish of watching people he loved diminish and die. He had sat in his own darkness, not once but many times, and something in that darkness had broken open. And what came through was not invincibility but understanding. He had found a way through, and then he had turned around to point the way for others. And for 25 centuries, the pointing had continued from one person to the next, one lamp to the next, across all the generations and the distances between them. This was what she was taking refuge in, not in a distant savior who would reach down and remove the fever from her quarter and the fear from her chest, but in the fact, the plain, verifiable, irreducible fact that a human being had walked through this kind of darkness before her and had found something real on the other side. That the darkness was not the final word. That there was a way through, and that finding it was possible for a person with a human body and a frightened mind, pressing her palms against a dirt floor in the dark. Something loosened in her chest. Dhammam saranam gacchami. I will undertake to find my home in the Dhamma. The Dhamma, the truth. The way things actually are, not as fear shapes them or hope distorts them, but as they simply, factually are. She had heard enough of the teachings to understand that the Dhamma was not a set of opinions about the world. It was the actual structure of experience itself, the law of impermanence that meant every fever would eventually break or end, that every night would become morning, that even the most total darkness was always in motion, always changing, never the permanent, unchanging absolute that fear insisted it was. She had not thought of truth itself as something you could shelter in. She had thought of truth as something cold and sometimes unkind, the truth of her husband's death, the truth of the money that ran short in the dry months, the truth of how alone she was. But sitting on the floor with her palms against the earth, she felt something different. The truth of this precise moment was not the spinning of tomorrow's catastrophes or the replaying of last year's losses. The truth of this moment was the coolness of the floor under her hands, the small sound of her daughter's breath, the fig tree visible as a dark shape against the courtyard's lesser darkness. The fact of being alive, in a body, in a room that was still standing. And in that truth, the actual, present, specific truth, not the imagined truth of future disasters, there was a steadiness she had not expected. The fear was still there. She was not suddenly unafraid, but the fear was sitting inside something larger than itself. The way a wave sits inside the ocean. The wave is real. It rises and it falls. But it is not the ocean. The ocean does not disappear when the wave does. And the truth, the plain, steady, present truth of what is actually here was like finding the ocean when you had been convinced you were nothing but waves. Sangam saranam gacchami. I will undertake to find my home in the Sangha. This one she had wondered about the most, across all her market edge listening. The Sangha, the community. It seemed, on the surface, the most precarious of the three refuges. Communities failed. Communities were made of human beings, and human beings died and left and disappointed and sometimes simply vanished from your life without explanation. She had trusted communities before and been left by them in the ordinary ways that people are left. But something shifted as she said the words. She thought of the elder bhikkhu whose name she didn't know. He had not been speaking to her specifically. He had been speaking to whoever was near enough to hear, in the plain and unhurried way of someone carrying a lamp through a street, not walking with the lamp for their own benefit, but simply walking, and the light falling where it fell. He had not known she was listening, and yet the words had reached her. Across the distance of a cloth stall, across the noise of morning commerce, the teaching had arrived. She had been part of the community even when she had not known herself to be part of it. And she understood. Then, something larger. The Sangha was not only the people you could see, the monks at the market, the neighbors in the lane, the other women at the adjacent stalls. The Sangha extended backward through time. It included every woman who had ever sat on a dirt floor in the dark and pressed her palms down hard and said these same words, in her own language, in her own darkness. It included women in kingdoms she would never know the names of, in centuries that had not yet arrived. Every person who had ever reached, in their worst night. For the handhold of these words, they were all here, in some sense. In this room, in this darkness, making it a little less alone. She was not the first. She would not be the last. And in the middle of all that, reaching all those palms, pressed to all those floors, across all those centuries, there was something that held, something that had been tested by exactly this kind of darkness, over and over, and had not given way. She said the words 3 times through, the way she had heard them said. Her voice did not tremble. It was very quiet and very steady, barely disturbing the air. When she finished, she sat for a long time without moving. She did not feel transcendent. She did not feel transported. She felt, instead, as though she had found a floor beneath the floor, something even more fundamental than the packed earth under her palms. Something that did not depend on harvests, or on the health of children, or on whether the man you had chosen to build your life with continued to breathe beside you. Something that was simply there, that had been there all along. That did not require her to have earned it. She lay back on her mat. She did not sleep immediately, but for the first time in 4 nights, the quality of the wakefulness changed. The circling thoughts slowed. The fear remained but became a softer thing, a cloud rather than a ceiling, something passing through a large open space rather than something filling every corner of a sealed room. And sometime before the first bird started, she slept, In the morning, Chanda woke before her and placed one small warm hand on Kamala's forehead, checking, with perfect unconscious mimicry, the way her mother checked her each night. Kamala lay still a moment with her eyes not yet open, feeling that hand, cool and present and real. Then she opened her eyes. The room was the same. The fig tree was still a fig tree. The money would still be what it was. The rains would still be late or not late. The world would still ask of her everything she had. But she rose differently. She set up her stall differently. She measured her cloth with the same honest hand, but the hand knew now what it rested on. And each morning after that, before rising, she said the 3 lines to the darkness of the room, not loudly, not as ceremony for anyone else to witness, but as a person might open a window each morning to feel the outside air, not because they need to be reminded that air exists, but because the opening is itself an act of remembering, a small gesture of returning to what holds. The teaching from this story settles gently now. The oldest continuously spoken words in the Buddhist tradition are not instructions. They are not commands. They do not tell you what to do, or who to be, or how to fix the thing that frightens you. They say, simply, I will undertake to find my home here, in the awareness that has found its way through darkness, in the truth of what is actually present, in the vast invisible community of all those who have pressed their palms to their own floors in their own darkest nights and reached, just as you are reaching now, for something real enough to hold. This is what the ancient teachers meant by refuge. Not rescue, not the removal of difficulty, but the discovery, and it can be made in any moment, on any floor, in any darkness, that there is something to come home to that does not depend on circumstances. That holds whether or not the rains arrive. That held for Kamala in Savati. That has held for 25 centuries. That holds, even now, in whatever room you are lying in whatever particular darkness is yours tonight. You don't have to understand this fully for it to be true. Kamala didn't. She said the words on a dirt floor because she was reaching for a handhold in the dark. And the handhold was there. Let your hands rest now, just as they are. Feel what they rest on. Notice the breath, the small reliable motion of it, arriving and releasing without your effort, the oldest rhythm in your body, the one that has been with you every moment of your life without interruption. This is the Dhamma, the simple factual truth of what is here. This is already home. This has always been home. Let the breath carry that understanding a little deeper, not into thought, but into the body, into the floor beneath you, into the steadiness that holds you even now. And as that ground begins to feel more certain beneath you, as the mind remembers, even slightly, what it is to rest. We travel now to another kind of belonging. Across the waters to a different landscape, a valley in old Vietnam, where a young woman is about to discover that the home she has been searching for has been following her the entire time. One breath ahead, waiting around every bend in the road. In the central highlands of Vietnam, where the land folds into long green ridges and the rivers run amber with iron-rich soil. There is a kind of bamboo that grows so densely in the ravines that in the rainy season you cannot see more than a few steps into it. The stalks stand close as temple columns, their bases wrapped in pale moss, their upper portions swaying in whatever wind finds its way through the mountains. When rain comes, and in this region, rain comes with great seriousness, as though the sky has been considering it for some time, and finally committed, the bamboo forest fills with a sound like applause. Gentle and continuous. 10,000 small surfaces receiving water at once. This is the landscape of our second story. Not a distant historical kingdom this time, but the near-past Vietnam in the years of transition and turbulence, when the old order of things had shifted and people had been moved, either by choice or by the weight of circumstance, from the places where they had grown up. Millions of people were in motion in those decades. Lives had been uprooted. Families had been separated by distances and silences that sometimes never fully closed. The land itself was the same land, the same amber rivers, the same bamboo ridges, the same smell of rain on hot stone, but many of its people were suddenly strangers to the places they found themselves living, wearing their homesickness like a second skin they could not remove. Into this landscape we bring a young woman named Lan, which in Vietnamese means orchid, a flower that grows not in pampered soil but in difficult places, in the bark of trees, in the crevices of limestone cliffs, taking its nourishment from air and rain and whatever the rock is willing to offer. Lan was 26 years old when this story begins. She had grown up in a small village in the Central Coast, a village that smelled of salt and dried fish, and the particular sweetness of jackfruit ripening in heavy heat. Her family had been weavers for 3 generations. Her grandmother had woven silk panels so fine that the light passed through them the way it passes through deep water, and her mother had carried the same skill forward. Her hands, knowing the patterns the way a body knows how to walk. Without needing to think through each step, Lan had learned beside her mother, sitting at the frame in the afternoon light, the shuttle passing through her fingers with a rhythm that felt, when she was young, as natural as breathing. But the village was far from the new administrative centers, and opportunities for weaving had contracted. When an offer came from a distant cousin in the highlands, work at a textile cooperative, a room in a shared house, a wage that was reliable if modest, Lan had taken it. She had packed one cloth bag, said goodbye to her mother on the doorstep in the way that people say goodbye when they are pretending it is not permanent, and walked to the road. That had been 2 years ago. And in those 2 years, she had been quietly, persistently, unable to feel that she was anywhere at all. The highlands were beautiful. She acknowledged this. The mornings were cool and mist-wrapped in a way the coast never was, the air carrying the green smell of growing things rather than salt. She had a bed, a yob, women she worked alongside who were kind enough, with their own histories of displacement and adjustment. By all the measures available to a person looking at her life from the outside, things were arranged correctly. But she woke each morning with a sensation she could not name precisely, not unhappiness, not despair, but a persistent sense of not arriving, as if the body had made the journey but something else had not caught up yet, as if she were somehow always in transit, always between one place and the next, never quite landing. She did a great deal of work. She ate her meals. She sent money home to her mother every month. She did all the things that constituted a life, and underneath all of it, like a slightly wrong note played continuously beneath a melody, was this feeling of homelessness that had nothing to do with the room she slept in. She had not told anyone about this. What would she say? Everything is fine, but I am somehow not here. The words sounded foolish even to herself. On a Sunday morning, in her second autumn in the highlands, Lan walked to the edge of the town, where a path wound into the bamboo forest above the cooperative. She had no purpose in going. She had finished her work for the week. There was nowhere she needed to be. She walked because the walls of the shared house felt close and she needed air, and she walked until the path left the last buildings behind and entered the trees. The bamboo closed around her. The sounds of the town, the motorbikes, the voices, the generator's hum receded gradually, replaced by the sound of wind in high green canopy and the occasional drip of water from last night's rain still releasing from the leaves. The path was soft with fallen matter, and her sandals made almost no sound. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she came to a place where the path opened slightly around a flat stone near a small stream. The stream was very clear and very quiet, barely moving. The kind of stream that looks like it is not flowing until you place something on its surface and watch it drift. She sat on the stone. She did not sit to meditate. She did not know how to meditate in any formal sense. She sat because she was tired, and the stone was there, and the sound of the stream was pleasant. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes open, looking at nothing in particular. And then something very simple happened. She noticed her breath. Not in a dramatic way. Not as revelation. She simply noticed it, the chest rising, the chest falling, the air going in and the air going out. She had been breathing every moment of her life and had never quite paid attention to it as a thing in itself. A constant quiet event happening in the body, regardless of where the body was. The breath did not know that she was in the highlands and not on the coast. The breath did not know that she was 2 years from home. The breath was simply here, doing what it had always done, arriving and releasing in the same rhythm it had always maintained. The same rhythm that would continue as long as she was alive. The same rhythm she shared with every other breathing creature in the bamboo forest around her. She stayed with this for a while. Just the breath. Just the chest moving. Just the air, highland air. Cool and green-scented. Carrying the information of bamboo and whetstone and distant rain moving through her. Something began to loosen. There was a nun in the town, a gentle, unassuming woman named Sister Tway, who ran a small lending library from the back room of the local temple, and who on Thursday evenings offered an informal gathering for anyone who wished to sit quietly and hear a short teaching. Lan had been once, early in her time in the highlands, and had found the sitting uncomfortable and the teaching too abstract and had not returned. But she remembered something Sister Tway had said almost offhandedly. In the way you say something you have said so many times, it has worn grooves into your speech about the Vietnamese Buddhist concept of quihong. Quihong, your homeland, your roots, your original ground. The place you came from and to which you belong, Sister Tway had said. In the Tian understanding, quihong does not refer to a village or a province or a coastline. It refers to something available in every step, every breath. She had said the old song phrase, quihong di ve trin moi ban chun. Your true homeland comes home with every footstep. She had said, the most important question is not where you are, but whether the mind can return to this moment. Because this moment, this breath, this stone, this stream, this body alive and present is always everywhere. Home. Lan had not understood this when she first heard it. It had sounded like the kind of thing people say to make displaced people feel better about displacement. Pretty words for an ugly situation. But sitting on the stone in the bamboo forest, feeling the breath moving through her body, she felt something shift, not an understanding that came through thinking, but one that arrived the way water arrives in a dry riverbed, quietly, without announcement, simply present, where before there had been absence. She was here, actually here, not waiting to arrive somewhere else, not the ghost of herself, hovering 2 years behind in the coastal village, looking out at the familiar sea, here on this stone, in this body, in this breath, in this precise moment of a Sunday morning in the highlands. The bamboo was here. The stream was here. The water sound was here. The cool air was here. And she was here in it, made of the same materials as everything around her, the same water, cycling through cloud and rain and stream and breath. The same minerals that were in the stone beneath her, also present in her bones. The same air that had been through 1,000 mountains and 1,000 lungs before it arrived in hers. This, she thought, or rather felt, since the sensation arrived before the words, "This is what they mean by interbeing." She was not a separate creature visiting this landscape. She was continuous with it. The boundary between where she ended and where the bamboo forest began was, in some sense, a convenience of language rather than a fact of experience. The breath made this undeniably clear. Every inhale was the world entering her body. Every exhale was her returning to the world. She had never left. She could not leave. She had been home in every breath she had ever taken. Whether the air was salt-flavored and coastal or green-flavored and highland. The home was not the flavor of the air. The home was the breathing itself. She began to cry. Not violently, not with any drama. The tears simply arrived, as if they had been waiting behind something that had finally opened, and she let them come without trying to understand them. Sometimes the body understands before the mind does, and requires its own way of acknowledging what it has found. After a while, the crying stopped. She sat. The stream moved. The bamboo swayed. A small bird, she didn't know its name, a dark-feathered bird with an orange beak, landed on a rock in the stream, looked at her with one round, serious eye, and then flew away into the green. She thought of her mother, not with the ache of absence that she had been carrying for 2 years, but with something warmer, a sense of nearness that the physical distance could not quite account for. Her mother was in the weaving, in the rhythm she carried in her hands. Her mother was in the patience she had learned at the loom, the knowledge that you do not force the thread, you follow the tension that is already there. Her mother was in the breath, the same breath, ultimately, that her mother breathed, that her grandmother had breathed, that would be breathed by whoever came after her. You carry the people you love, not as photographs of absence, but as the living texture of who you have become. They are not somewhere else. They are here, woven into you, present in every motion of your hands. She walked back to the town in the late morning, through the bamboo forest that now felt less like a foreign landscape and more like a particular expression of the same world she had always inhabited. She noticed the way the light came through the canopy. She noticed the sound of her footsteps. She noticed the breath still happening, still reliable, still bringing the world in and sending it back out. Doing this work without her needing to think about it, or deserve it, or earn it. She went back to Sister Tway's Thursday gathering that week, and the week after that, and she began to understand that the teaching was not consolation for the displaced, not a spiritual way of saying that it doesn't matter where you live. It was something more honest and more radical than that. It was the recognition that the longing for home was actually the longing to be present, to be actually here, in this body, in this moment, rather than hovering between the past you've left and the future you're building. And that presence, complete, undivided presence, was not a destination you reached by traveling far enough. It was available in every breath. It had been available in every breath she had ever taken. She had simply not known, until a flat stone by a small stream showed her where to look. She wrote to her mother that month, a longer letter than usual, describing the highlands in detail she had not bothered with before, now that she had actually arrived in them. She described the bamboo and the cool mornings and the little bird with the orange beak. She described the sound of rain on the cooperative's tin roof at night. which was different from the sound of rain on the palm leaf roof of home, but which was, she had begun to understand. The same rain. Her mother wrote back with news of the village and a small question at the end. It sounds like you have found something there. What is it? Lan wrote back. I think it is just where I was all along. The teaching from this story breathes gently into the room. There is a Vietnamese phrase that the teachers of Plum Village use in their practice, a phrase from a walking song that practitioners learn early and carry for the rest of their lives. Quê hương đi về trên mỗi bàn chân. Your true homeland comes home with every footstep. The teaching is not that home is everywhere in some vague spiritual sense that avoids the specific grief of distance and loss. The teaching is more precise than that. Home is this moment, fully inhabited. And this moment is available in every breath. The homesickness that most of us carry is not, at its deepest level, about a place. It is about presence. It is about the particular ache of feeling that we are somehow elsewhere than where we are, that the real life is happening somewhere we can no longer reach, or somewhere we have not yet arrived, or somewhere just around the bend if we could only adjust enough things correctly. The Vietnamese Thien tradition calls this trôi len, drifting and rolling the mind's constant motion away from the place where the body actually stands. The remedy is not to stop feeling the loss of places you have loved. Loss is real. Distance is real. The longing for what you have known and left is a kind of love, and it deserves to be honored rather than dismissed. But beneath the longing, beneath all the maps of where you have been and where you wish you were, there is something that has not moved. Something that was home before you knew your first address. The breath knows this. The body knows this. The breath has been going home in every inhale, returning in every exhale, without interruption, since the first moment you were alive. Feel that now. The breath moving through you, just as it has always moved. The body here, present, resting in the space that holds it. This room is the world's way of meeting you tonight. This breath is your oldest, most faithful companion, always here, always arriving, always releasing, always home. Let your hands soften. Let the exhale be a little longer than the inhale. Let the body settle into what is already underneath it. You don't need to travel anywhere. You are already where the breath is, and the breath is always home. And as that belonging settles a little deeper into the body, as the mind remembers what it is to actually be somewhere, we travel north and back in time, to the mountains of medieval Korea, where a young scholar has been searching for home in every scripture he can find, and where a very old Sion master is waiting to show him that the text he has been reading was never a map to anywhere other than here. In the spirit of Korean Sion practice, inspired by the tradition of Bojo Jinul and the Goryeo mountain monasteries of the 12th century, consider this story of a young monk who searched for the sacred in every place except the most obvious one. The scriptorium at Cheongwonsa Temple sat at the northern end of the main compound, separated from the monk's sleeping hall by a garden of raked gravel and 3 old pine trees whose roots had lifted the stone pavers in ways the abbot had long since given up trying to repair. The room itself was long and low, its timber walls darkened by decades of lamp oil and incense smoke, its narrow windows positioned high so that light came in at an angle useful for reading but not, unfortunately, for writing, which was why the 4 monks who worked there had trained themselves to write by feel as much as by sight, their brushes moving across the mulberry paper manuscripts with the confident automaticity of long practice. Hasting had arrived at Cheongwonsa 4 years ago at the age of 19, carrying 2 cloth bundles, one containing his few personal effects, the other containing the 11 manuscripts he had already copied and annotated by hand since the age of 14. He was the son of a provincial administrator in the foothills east of Kaohsiung, a man who valued learning with the seriousness that the Goryeo scholar class reserved for things that could be examined and measured. The boy had shown early aptitude for calligraphy and an almost alarming capacity for textual memorization. And when it became clear that his temperament ran more toward the monastery than the examination hall, his father had arranged his ordination with the same administrative efficiency he brought to all transitions, cleanly, thoroughly, and without sentimentality. Hasting had not minded leaving. He had been, in certain ways, waiting to leave, waiting for a place where the questions he carried could be properly housed. Questions about the nature of mind, about awareness, about what the texts meant when they spoke of the original face, of the light that was never extinguished, of the awareness that the masters called luminous and empty at once. He had been reading about these things since he was 15, copying sutra after sutra, with the conviction that understanding was there in the texts, the way treasure is there in a sealed chest, requiring only the right effort of reading, the right angle of interpretation, the right accumulation of scholarship to be finally, definitively grasped. 4 years later, he had read more than most monks twice his age. He could recite whole chapters of the Avatamsaka Sutra by heart. He had worked through commentaries on the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, the writings of the great Chinese Chan masters, the Korean annotations of the Flower Garland teaching. He had annotated, cross-referenced, compared. He had read about numinous awareness in 17 different formulations and could explain the differences between them with precision. And he remained, in some fundamental way he could not name, precisely where he had begun. The specific nature of his difficulty was this: the texts all pointed toward an awareness that was said to be present, immediate and undeniable, an awareness that, the masters insisted, was not something to be achieved or developed or imported from elsewhere, but simply recognized, the way you recognize your own face in water you didn't know was a mirror. And yet every time Hasting read about this awareness, what he encountered was more reading. Every time he sought the thing the words described, he found more words. The finger pointing at the moon, he knew from Huaneng, from Zhongmi, from Jinwu's own essays circulating in copied form through the monasteries, was not the moon itself. But how, exactly, did one stop looking at the finger? The more carefully he read the instruction not to look at the finger, the more thoroughly he found himself staring at it. It was late autumn when he finally gathered himself and went to speak with the old master who lived in the small hermitage above the main compound, a monk named Wulam, who was 73 years old and who had, by general understanding among the younger monks, seen something the rest of them had not yet seen. Wulam was not the abbot. He held no official position. He spent most of his days sitting, working occasionally in the small plot of winter vegetables beside his hermitage, and receiving, on certain evenings, whoever came to sit with him. Hasting had been putting off this visit for 2 years, partly from pride and partly from a formless worry that the visit might not yield what he hoped, and that this would be worse than not going at all. He climbed the path in the hour before evening practice, the air carrying the particular cold clarity of late autumn in the mountains, a sharpness that caught in the throat and smelled of pine resin and frost-touched earth, and the faint mineral scent of stone. The leaves had mostly fallen. The path was soft with them, brown and copper, and the occasional remnant yellow, already beginning their dissolution back into soil. His breath came visible in small clouds. Wulam was sitting outside his hermitage door on a worn wooden platform, wrapped in his outer robe against the cold, his eyes open and resting on nothing in particular. He did not look up when Hasting approached, though he was clearly not asleep. Hasting bowed and sat on the lower step. There was a silence. In the valley below, a temple bell rang for the beginning of the evening sitting. The sound rose and dispersed and was gone. "I have been reading," Hasting said finally, which was not quite what he had meant to say but was true. "Yes," said Wulam. "I have read what the masters say about the luminous awareness, the mind that is void and calm, the original face. I have read Zongmi and Jinul's passages. I have read the 6th Patriarch's Sutra 3 times through." He paused. "I cannot find the thing they are pointing at." Wulam said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "When you were reading just now, on the path coming up, what was aware of your feet on the leaves?" Hasting blinked. "I was aware. What is this I that was aware? My mind. My consciousness. And was this consciousness reading a sutra? No," Hasting said. "I was walking. And yet it was aware. Yes. And in the scriptorium, when you copy the manuscripts, when the brush is moving and the characters are forming, and your attention is held by the precision of the strokes, what is aware of the brush? I am," Hasting said. He felt, dimly, that something was being arranged around him that he could not yet see the shape of. And when you finish a difficult passage and set the brush down and simply rest for a moment, not reading, not writing, just resting, is awareness present then? Yes. More present, or less present, than when you are reading? Hasting opened his mouth and then closed it. He sat with the question. The cold air moved around them. A small bird passed overhead, black against the pale sky. "I don't know," he said slowly. "It seems the same. The awareness seems the same." Wulam nodded once, as if this were exactly sufficient. "The masters call it luminous awareness," he said quietly, "because it is luminous, it illuminates whatever arises, and because it is never absent." In the study hall, it reads, "On the path, it walks and notices the leaves. In the moment of rest, it simply rests. Whether you are confused or clear, anxious or peaceful, asleep or awake, it is here." The texts point to this, but the pointing happens through words, and words are objects that the awareness reads. So the student reads the words and looks for awareness as if it were another object to be found inside the words. He paused. "You have spent 4 years looking for the lamp inside its own light." Something happened in Hasting's chest. Not a dramatic event. Not the thunderclap that certain seance stories described. Something quieter, a subtle shift, like the moment when eyes adjust to a change in light, and what was there all along becomes simply, plainly visible. He sat with it. Below them, the valley held the last pale glow of the sky before dark. The pine trees around the hermitage moved slightly in a wind too subtle to feel on the skin. "All this time," he said, half to himself. "All this time," Wulam agreed, without judgment. "And now you have turned around and seen what was doing the looking. This is what Jinul calls tracing back the radiance, not going forward into the text to find it, but turning back to notice what has been here, illuminating every page you ever read." Hasting looked at his hands, resting on his knees. He was aware of them. He was aware of the cold stone of the step beneath him. He was aware of the awareness itself, or rather, he noticed that awareness was simply present, had always been present, did not need to be summoned or cultivated into existence, was no more possible to turn off than it was possible for the eye to unsee what is already seen. "The texts were not wrong," he said carefully. "The texts were not wrong," Wulam said. They pointed accurately. You simply looked at the pointing rather than in the direction pointed. This is natural. This is what the intellect does. It grasps. And in grasping, it misses the thing that cannot be grasped because it is already doing the grasping. Hasting stayed until full dark, sitting in silence beside the old teacher. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of the same awareness that had been present in the scriptorium, on the mountain path, in the dormitory before sleep, in the dreams themselves. The awareness that was, as the tradition said, never dark, never absent, never in need of being earned through any amount of reading or practice. Though reading and practice could point the student back toward it until the turning happened on its own. He went back to the scriptorium the next morning. He copied manuscripts with the same careful brushstrokes he had always used. He read the same commentaries, but something had shifted in how he held the activity. He was no longer reading in order to arrive somewhere. He was reading as an expression of awareness that had already arrived, awareness that had, he understood now, never once left. In the weeks that followed, he sometimes tried to explain this to the younger monks and mostly failed, which made him understand something further, that the pointing was difficult precisely because what it pointed to was not a new thing but the oldest thing. Not an achievement, but a recognition. Not something added to experience, but something that had been the ground of experience all along. The texts were not maps to a hidden country. They were mirrors held up to show what was already standing in front of them. He did not stop reading. Jinul had not stopped reading. The texts remained. But now, when he read, he sometimes looked up from the manuscript and simply rested in what was reading, and in that resting, found the thing that every page had been trying, in its patient way, to show him. The teaching from this story rests gently in the room. There is a particular kind of searching that carries within it an assumption so deep we rarely notice it is an assumption at all. The assumption is that what we are looking for is somewhere other than here. The intellect, which is a magnificent instrument for finding things that are genuinely elsewhere, applies this same seeking motion to awareness itself, as if awareness were a hidden object to be located through sufficient effort, through the right combination of understanding and technique. And so the search circles and circles, and every circle is honest, and every circle nonetheless misses the thing that was never lost. The Korean Seon tradition calls this pattern by many names. The image that appears most often is of a person holding a lamp and searching desperately for light. The lamp is already lit. The searching is already illuminated by the very thing it seeks. But the attention is so fixed on the forward motion of seeking that it does not pause to notice what is doing the looking. Feel this now. This moment, the weight of the body, the texture of the air, the quiet sounds of wherever you are. What is aware of these things? You are. And what is this awareness? It does not have a location. It does not have a beginning or an end that you can find. It is simply here, open, receiving whatever arises, the sounds, the sensations, this voice, this moment. It has been here every moment you have ever lived. In every good moment and every difficult one. In every confusion and every clarity. Never absent. Never dark. You don't need to achieve this awareness. You cannot. It was already present before the first breath you ever drew, and it will be present when the last one has been released. The searching was always being carried by it. The reading was always illuminated by it. Let the shoulders soften. Let the hands be still. There is nothing to find. Everything that was ever being searched for was always the thing doing the searching. Let this settle into the body rather than into the mind. The mind will want to analyze it. The body simply knows, I am here. I have always been here. Here is home. And as that recognition quietly dissolves, the need to search further. As the mind rests in what has always been resting beneath its motion. We travel now across the sea and forward through the centuries to a prosperous Tang dynasty town in southern China, where a merchant named Bao has spent 40 years building houses everywhere his travels took him, and who has just arrived at the end of a long road, at the only threshold he has never crossed. In the spirit of Chinese Chan Buddhism, drawing from the tradition of the Tang dynasty lay people who discovered that the marketplace and the monastery were not so different after all. Consider this story of a merchant named Bao, and the afternoon he finally stopped building. The city of Yangzhou sat where the Grand Canal met the Yangtze River. And in the second half of the 8th century of the Common Era, it was the kind of city that seemed to have been constructed specifically to demonstrate what abundance could look like when all the waterways of an empire converged at once. The canal brought silk from Suzhou, grain from the Lake District, lacquerware from the workshops of Fuzhou, and salt, enormous quantities of salt. The kind of cargo that built family fortunes in a generation and eroded them in two. The Yangtze brought everything else, wood from upriver, merchants from the southwest, ideas from wherever ideas come from when they travel on water. The docks smelled of rope fiber and fish sauce and the particular sweetness of new lumber, and the market streets behind them smelled of the roasted grain cakes that the vendors sold from clay braziers at every intersection, and the whole city smelled, in the evenings when the wind came off the river, of the mud and minerals and distance that the water carried within it. Bao had lived in Yangzhou for most of his 43 years. Though he had been born in a village 3 days' walk to the west, a village small enough that the arrival of a peddler with a pack mule constituted a significant event. He had come to Yangzhou at 17 with a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who traded in dried goods, had apprenticed himself to the man's impatience and precision for 6 years, and had then, with characteristic thoroughness, built his own trading house from what he had saved and learned. By 40, he controlled a modest but reliable operation: grain storage, canal, transport contracts, a small stake in a silk weaving partnership. He had a house near the southern market with a tile roof and a courtyard where his wife grew bitter melon and chrysanthemums in large terracotta pots. He had a son studying for the examinations. He had 2 daughters. He had, by any reasonable accounting, the life he had set out to build. And yet, Bao had a habit that his wife found puzzling and his business partner found mildly irritating. Wherever he traveled for work, to Suzhou, to Hangzhou, to the northern distribution towns along the canal, he built something. Not large projects, small ones. In Suzhou, he had paid to repair the garden wall of a Chan temple where he often rested on the road. In Hangzhou, he had commissioned a small pavilion beside a lake viewpoint that he had come to feel was incomplete without one. In several canal towns, he had funded the repair of guest lodges where traveling merchants spent the night. He kept careful records of these expenditures, as he kept careful records of everything. But when his partner asked why he spent this money, Bao found he could not give an entirely satisfying answer. Something about wanting there to be good places. Something about each city feeling not quite finished without his contribution to it. Something he did not examine too closely because examining it might reveal something he was not ready to know. He had been doing this for 15 years when he met the old layman at the Faming Temple. He had stopped at Faming Temple on the western edge of Yangzhou because he passed it often on his way to the northern docks and had, over the years, developed the habit of pausing there to drink tea from the small clay cup the gate monk kept available for travelers. It was autumn, the light low and amber across the temple compound. the ginkgo trees in the outer garden turning the precise yellow of old beeswax. He entered the gate, accepted the tea, and sat on the long stone bench against the wall. The old man was already sitting there, at the far end of the bench. He was perhaps 70, perhaps older, the kind of age that becomes difficult to specify because the face has moved beyond the categories that make specification meaningful. He wore the plain grey robe of a lay Buddhist, somewhat worn at the collar. He was drinking tea. He was doing nothing else. He was doing nothing else with a quality of completeness that Baha, who was rarely in one place long enough to be doing nothing with any quality at all, noticed immediately. They sat for a time without speaking. A monk crossed the courtyard carrying a bucket of water. The ginkgo leaves moved, and occasionally one released and fell, which, in the low autumn light, looked like something intended. "You came from the North Docks," the old man said. It was not a question. "From the grain offices," Baha said. "And before that from Suzhou. Long travel. I don't mind it." And this was true. Baha thought. He did not mind travel. In fact, he preferred being in motion to being still. Being in motion had a forward quality that he found comfortable, the sense of going somewhere, of progress being made, of the next place always available on the road ahead. The old man said, "You have come here before." "Many times." Baha said, "I come for the tea." The old man looked at him with the mild, uncategorizing attention of someone who has run out of reasons to sort people into types. "What are you building these days?" he said. Baha looked at him with surprise. He had not mentioned his building projects. "How do you know I build things? You have the look of someone who is always completing something," the old man said. Not unkindly. Simply observationally, as if noting a fact about the weather. A certain quality of restlessness. The eyes that go to what is incomplete in a room. Baha was quiet for a moment. He thought about the pavilion in Hangzhou. He thought about the 3 warehouses along the Suzhou Canal that he had had re-roofed at his own expense when the trading cooperative decided the repair was not urgent enough. He thought about the courtyard of his own house, which his wife considered finished and which he considered he had never said this out loud, not yet quite right. "I am repairing a guest lodge in a town 3 days north," he said. "The roof beams are sound, but the floor is earthen and gets cold in winter. I am having tile put in." "Good floors," the old man said. "Yes. And in the spring, I intend to add a covered walkway to the temple here, along the east wall, so that visitors can wait for the rain to stop without standing in it. Generous. I have the materials already spoken for," Baha said. And then, because something in the old man's attention invited honesty, "I am not sure why I do it. My wife says I cannot pass a place without wanting to improve it. My partner says I am building the city that should have been built when I was young and wasn't." He paused. Perhaps both are true. The old man finished his tea and set the cup down on the bench between them with careful attention, as if the placement mattered. "Where do you rest?" he said. "I beg your pardon, you build places for others to rest." "Guest lodges, pavilions, covered walkways. Where do you yourself rest?" Baha opened his mouth and then did not speak. He looked at the ginkgo tree. A leaf fell. The question had arrived somewhere behind his sternum and was sitting there with a weight that was disproportionate to its simplicity. "At home," he said finally. "In Yangzhou." "And are you resting there now?" "I am at the temple." "Yes," said the old man. "And when you are at home in Yangzhou, you are planning the guest lodge. And when you are at the guest lodge, you are thinking of the next project." And when you finish a project, you feel for a brief time satisfied. And then the satisfaction drains away and you look for what needs to be done next. He said this without judgment, with a kind of tender accuracy that made it worse rather than better. Am I near the truth? Bao sat for a long time. Around him, the temple compound did what temple compounds do in the late afternoon, held its air, filtered its light through old wood and older stone, conducted its ordinary business with an unhurried quality that belonged to it and did not belong to anything else. I never thought about it that way, he said. I thought the building was the resting. I thought I was making places to come to. You have been making the idea of a place to come to, the old man said, rather than coming to the place you are already in. He picked up his cup and turned it in his hands, a small cup. Rough-fired, plain, unremarkable. This cup is complete, he said. It holds what it holds. I do not need to add a handle. I do not need to smooth its edges. I do not need to think about what it will become when it is better. He set it down. The courtyard here is complete. The bench is complete. The ginkgo tree is complete. The autumn afternoon is complete. This moment, sitting with the tea still warm in the hands, complete. And I am not, Bao said. It was not a question. You keep building yourself toward a place you imagine will finally feel like home, the old man said. But the building is what prevents the arriving. The arriving happens when the building stops, not permanently, not forever. But in this moment, in any moment, you choose to stop and receive what is already here. He looked at the sky, pale, cloud-marked, that particular shade of late afternoon that exists at the precise threshold between daylight and the onset of evening. The Chan teachers say, the sacred is not elsewhere. The sacred is hauling water, carrying firewood, sitting on a bench, drinking tea in a temple courtyard while the ginkgo leaves fall. These are not preparations for the sacred. They are it. Bao sat on the bench until the evening bell rang, which was longer than he had sat anywhere without a purpose in years. He did not think about the guest lodge or the covered walkway or the courtyard at home that his wife considered finished. He sat with his empty cup in his hands and watched the ginkgo tree release its leaves one by one in the fading light, each one falling with the casual completeness of a thing that has fulfilled exactly what it was. He thought of his wife in the courtyard at home, the bitter melon vines along the south wall, the way she moved between the terracotta pots with a quality of presence he had always noticed but never quite named. She was not going anywhere. She was there fully, completely there, and the courtyard was enough. He had spent 15 years trying to build a courtyard that matched that quality, in city after city, project after project, and had not understood that the quality did not come from the courtyard. It came from the arriving. He went back to Yangzhou. He commissioned the covered walkway for Faming Temple in the spring, as he had promised. Because a promise is a promise, and because a covered walkway is a genuinely useful thing. But he built it differently than he had built other things, not to complete the temple, which did not need completing, but simply as an act of attention and care. The way you might offer tea to a guest, not because the guest lacks tea, but because the offering is itself a kind of presence. He sat more often in his own courtyard after that. He learned, slowly and with effort, because this was harder than building things. The way that stopping is always harder than motion to notice when he had arrived. The smell of the bitter melon in the early morning. The weight of his wife's hand on the back of his chair when she passed behind him. The particular quality of Yangzhou light on the tile roof in late afternoon, which he had never really looked at before because he had always been planning something. It did not stay. He was a merchant, and merchants plan, and the mind forgets and returns to motion as naturally as water finds its level. But he remembered the bench and the ginkgo tree and the old man's plain cup, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes the remembering was enough to stop the building for a moment. And in that moment, he could feel what the old man had meant, that the resting place he had been building toward his entire life was not a place he had not yet constructed. It was the place he was standing in, right now. The only place he had ever actually been. The teaching from this story settles quietly into the listening mind. There is a particular exhaustion that does not come from working too hard, but from a subtler source, from the persistent sense that where we are is not quite the destination, that the real arrival is still ahead, contingent on the next completion, that when this project is finished, this problem resolved, this goal achieved, this renovation done, then we will be able to rest. Then it will feel like home. The Chan teachers of the Tang dynasty called this the Great Confusion. Not a moral failing, not ignorance about Buddhist doctrine, simply the deeply human tendency to locate the sacred perpetually in the next moment rather than this one. The merchant who builds guest lodges everywhere except inside himself. The meditator who sits each day waiting for the real meditation to begin. The person who prepares so thoroughly for rest that they never actually rest. We know this pattern intimately. We have all built our pavilions in other cities while the courtyard at home waited in the ordinary light. Feel your hands now, the weight of them resting wherever they rest. This is a complete sensation. It does not need to be improved. The air in this room, at this temperature, carrying whatever sounds are present complete. Nothing requires adding. Nothing requires the next thing to make this moment finally adequate. Let your shoulders lower. Let the exhale be a little longer. The resting place has been here the whole time. Not as an achievement, not as a reward for finishing. Just here, available in any moment, the building pauses and the arriving happens. Just this moment. Just this breath. Just this already home. And as that recognition allows the body to soften a little more into what already holds it, as the restlessness quiets into something warmer. We travel now to the mountains of medieval Japan, where a young nun at a remote training hall is learning that the practice she has been doing all along is itself the homecoming she has been seeking, that there is no arrival after the practice, because the practice is already the arrival. In each moment it is done, in the spirit of Japanese Soto Zen, inspired by the teachings of Eihei Dogen and the mountain training halls of 13th century Ekizen province. Consider this story of a young nun named Toku who traveled a long way to find what she had been doing all along. The mountains of Ekizen in winter are not cruel. Exactly. They are simply indifferent in the way that mountains are indifferent, their cold arriving not as hostility but as simple fact. The snow settling into the cedar forests with a patience that does not register the distinction between what it covers and what it leaves bare. The paths between the hermitages that had begun appearing in those years, in the wake of Dogen's founding of Aihaiji deep in these same mountains, were narrow enough that two people could not walk abreast. And in the deep months of winter, they became something closer to suggestions than paths. The snow erasing the boundary between where the trail had been and where the mountain simply continued. Cedar branches held their loads of white until a weight of wind or animal dislodged them. Then the snow fell again, silently, onto whatever was underneath. Toku had walked the last 3 hours of this journey alone, her sandals packed with straw against the cold, her outer robe carrying a dampness at the shoulders from the cedar branches she had ducked beneath. She was 22 years old and had left Kyoto 9 days earlier. traveling east and then north on roads that grew progressively quieter and less maintained until the road stopped entirely and she followed directions from a farmer's wife into the hills. The farmer's wife had looked at her with the mild pity people reserved for those who appear to have made choices that cannot easily be reconsidered. She had been ordained at 15 at a temple in Kyoto, where the practice was principled but measured, where the morning sittings lasted 1 hour and the afternoons were given to sutra study and the preparation of meals, where the senior nuns moved through the days with a composed and unhurried quality that Toku had admired and had, in her quieter and more honest moments, found faintly insufficient. Not wrong, not unkind, simply not enough of something she could not name precisely. The way a meal that is adequate in every measurable respect can still leave a person with the particular hunger that is not about food. She had been grateful for the temple. She had been, year by year, imperceptibly, slightly suffocated by it. She had heard about the mountain hermitages from a traveling monk who had stopped at the Kyoto temple the previous spring on his way east. He was a Soto monk, thin and weathered in the way of people who spend considerable time outdoors in conditions that are not comfortable, and he had described the practice in the Ekizen hills in the kind of language that is specific and careful, long sittings before dawn, silence through the working hours, a community that treated the washing of bowls and the splitting of wood as seriously as the formal sitting periods. He described an abbot who taught that every action of the day was the same practice as zazen, that the way was not something cultivated in the meditation hall and then carried carefully into daily life, but something that either permeated everything or was nowhere at all. And he mentioned, in passing, a senior nun named Muir who had been with Dogen's community in its early years at Koshoyi, before the move to Ekizen, and who was said to hold the teaching in a manner that the formal documents did not quite capture something closer to the marrow of it, something that became clear in her presence in ways that it did not in her explanations. Toku had listened to this description with the full attention of someone hearing something they had needed to hear and had not known they were waiting for. 3 months later, she had packed her 2 robes, her lacquered eating bowl, her needle and thread and a small knife, and the particular quality of resolve that belongs to 22-year-olds before experience has had the opportunity to teach them the difference between resolve and stubbornness. The hermitage appeared through the trees when she had nearly given up expecting it, a cluster of low timber buildings set into the hillside in the way that practical structures settle when they have been built not for appearance but for function in a specific climate. Snow was piled against the north walls of each building. Smoke rose from 2 of the 3 chimneys in thin white columns that bent slightly to the east where a higher wind caught them above the tree line. The gate was simple, 2 upright cedar posts and a crossbeam. No gate itself, just the idea of a threshold, the bare minimum of demarcation between outside and inside. Toku stopped at the gate and bowed to what the threshold represented to the teaching and the community held within these grounds, to the lineage that ran back through Dogen's teacher, Urgen in China, and from there, back through the long chain of transmission into the earliest days of the practice. Then she walked through. A young novice was sweeping the path between the main hall and the kitchen building with a broom that left clean arcs in the snow. She looked up at Toku with the unsurprised expression of someone who had been told to expect a visitor, or who had simply made peace with the fact that the world delivers what it delivers without warning. She gestured with the broom handle toward the kitchen door and returned to her sweeping in the same motion, as if the greeting and the practice were one continuous gesture, which perhaps they were. Toku went to the kitchen door, stepped out of her sandals in the entry, and was given a bowl of hot water with a pickled plum by a nun who did not introduce herself, but whose hands, moving the bowl across the low wooden counter, had the quality of hands that have performed 10,000 small acts of service and no longer require the acts to mean anything beyond what they are. Toku drank the hot water and felt the warmth arrive in Stage's throat, chest, then slowly outward through the cold, tightened muscles of her shoulders and back. She had not realized how cold she was until the warmth began to displace it. Myoe appeared that evening at the community's sitting small and extremely upright, her white hair gathered neatly under her practice cap, her face carrying the particular composure of someone who has stopped negotiating with the present moment and has simply agreed to be in it. She sat for the full 2-hour period without shifting her posture once. Toku, sitting 3 places to her left, found herself watching, despite knowing that watching was not the instruction, the quality of the older nun's stillness, which was not the stillness of suppression, of a body forced into immobility by discipline, but something else entirely, the stillness of a body that had found the position in which it was already and exactly where it needed to be, and had simply stopped moving for that reason. After the sitting, Myoe spoke briefly about the schedule for the following week, an adjustment to the wood-gathering rotation, a repair needed on the roof of the outer storage building before the next heavy snowfall, and then dismissed the community to sleep. She did not look at Toku specifically. Toku had the distinct impression of having been seen regardless. Over the weeks that followed, Toku settled into the hermitage's rhythm, the wake bell before dawn in winter, 1 hour later than the summer hour, so that it rang in absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that has weight and texture rather than merely the absence of light. The walk to the meditation hall in sandals across snow that had hardened overnight into a surface that squeaked under each step. The 2-hour sitting, the hall lit by a single oil lamp whose flame burned steadily and cast long shadows across the wooden floor. After the sitting, the communal morning service, voices joining in the ancient syllables of the sutras, then the meal miso and pickled vegetables and the dense, slightly sour rice that was the staple of mountain temple life, eaten in silence with deliberate attention, each bite taken fully before the next began. The bowl received and held and returned with the same quality of care that was given to the formal sitting periods. Then work, sweeping, wood splitting, the mending of torn clothing, the grinding of grain, the maintenance of the buildings against the persistent intention of winter to occupy them, then afternoon sitting, then the evening, then sleep on the thin mat on the tan platform, the cold so present in the sleeping hall, that breath clouded even inside. She had come expecting to break through. This was the exact word that had formed in her mind during those 9 days of walking, when she had had little to do but walk and think and refine her intention, breakthrough, that at some point in the deep sitting, something would open that had been closed, some understanding, some experience, some quality of clarity or peace, or simply recognition that she had been circling without reaching it, would arrive. Finally, and she would emerge from that sitting changed in a way she could feel, different in a way that would be as unmistakable as the difference between standing in darkness and stepping into light. She sat with this expectation every morning, and every morning the bell rang at the end, and she rose from her cushion, and the day continued its business, and nothing had opened, and she was, apparently, precisely the same person who had arrived from Kyoto with straw-packed sandals and the careful conviction that she was going somewhere. By the 3rd week she was concerned. By the 5th, she was quietly desperate in the particular way of a person who has invested significantly in a destination and cannot find it on any map. By the 7th week, she had begun staying in the hall after the morning bell released the community remaining on her cushion while the others filed out for their work assignments, telling herself this was diligence and suspecting, in the more honest territory of her mind, that it might be something else. The last strategy of a person who has run out of other strategies. Extended effort as a substitute for understanding. It was Myoe who came to find her one such morning, appearing in the hall doorway while Toku still sat, the older nun's sandals making almost no sound on the cold boards. She stood in the doorway for a moment in silence, which Toku felt without seeing the change in the quality of the room that another person's presence creates. "The kitchen needs wood," Myoe said. Her voice had the same quality as her stillness, not soft, not hard, simply present. Toku rose immediately and moved toward the door. As she drew level with Myoe in the narrow entry, the senior nun did not move entirely aside, so that Toku had to pause. "Why do you remain when the others have gone?" Myoe asked. Not as accusation, with the gentleness of a question that is also, precisely, a diagnosis. "I thought more sitting would help," Toku said. Saying it aloud, she heard how it sounded. "Help with what?" Myoe asked. The question was simple, and it arrived somewhere behind Toku's sternum with unexpected force. She stood with it. Outside, through the hall's narrow window, the cedar branches moved slightly in a wind too subtle to hear from inside. A woodpecker worked steadily at something in the distance, one regular, repeated impact, patient and unhurried. "I am waiting," Toku said. "I came here to break through something, to arrive somewhere. And I keep sitting, and the sitting ends, and I am still." She stopped. She did not have the word for what she still was. "The same?" Myoe offered. "Yes. And this seems wrong to you." "The masters describe transformation," Toku said. "Urgen describes casting off body and mind. Something is supposed to happen. Something is supposed to change." Myoe was quiet for a moment. Through the entry where they stood came the smell of the morning's cooking, the faint bitterness of miso, the earthier warmth of grain, and beneath that, the cold mineral smell of the snow outside and the cedar of the building itself, which had absorbed decades of incense and lamp oil and the particular compound of human presence in a small space over long time. "When Urgen describes casting off body and mind," Myoe said carefully, "he is not describing an event that occurs once, at the end of sufficient practice, as a reward for accumulated sitting. He is describing what happens in each genuine moment of shikantaza, each full, undivided moment of just sitting. Body and mind are cast off in the sitting itself, not after it, not as its result. In it." She paused. "But the casting off cannot happen while you are watching for it. The watching is itself the thing that must be cast off." Toku said nothing. The woodpecker continued its work in the cedar forest. "Let me ask you something," Myoe said. "When you split wood this morning before the sitting, when the axe was in your hands and the log was on the block and you swung, where were you?" Toku considered this honestly. "Splitting wood," she said. "Were you waiting for something?" "No." She thought of it. The weight of the axe handle, the particular resistance of cold cedar grain, the clean sound when the split went true, the smell of the exposed wood, sharp, greenish, slightly sweet. "No," she said again. "There was just the wood and the axe and the cold and the splitting." "That," said Myoe, "is it?" Toku looked at her. "That is the practice Urgen is pointing to. Not the dramatic casting off. Not the special experience. The splitting of the wood when you are so fully in the splitting that there is no Toku standing apart from the splitting, observing it, waiting for something to happen during it. There is only the axe and the log and the cold air and the moment of separation. She turned slightly toward the window. The light in the hall had been shifting as they spoke, the pale winter morning deepening toward the clarity that comes when cloud thins rather than clears. Every moment of that quality is practice realization. Not practice leading toward realization. Practice that is already realization. Because it is completely, undividedly this moment, with nothing withheld and nothing awaited. But surely more is required. Toku said, more discipline, more sitting. More is not the direction. Miwa said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was precise. The precision of someone cutting away something that will cause harm if left. You have been adding hours to the sitting, adding effort to the attention, adding future expectation to the present moment. Dogen's teaching does not go in that direction. It goes in the direction of less waiting, less anticipation, less arrangement of this moment around the next one. She looked at Toku directly. You are here. This hall is here. This morning is here. The wood that needs splitting is here. There is nowhere else for practice to occur and nothing else for it to be. The silence that followed this had a different quality than the silences Toku had been sitting inside for 7 weeks. Those silences had been full of listening for something. This one was simply what it was, the hermitage in the winter morning. 2 women in a doorway. The distant woodpecker. The smell of miso. Then, what was I supposed to come here to find? Toku asked. Mioe looked at her with something that might have been warmth or might have been simply recognition. You came to find out that you were already finding it, she said. This is not the answer that satisfies the mind looking for a destination. The mind wants a map with a marked location. Dogen's teaching does not have a marked location. It has only this step, and then this step, and then this step. She stepped back from the doorway. The kitchen needs wood. Toku went to the woodpile. She lifted the axe, balanced its weight in her hands for a moment, the familiar slight heaviness, the worn smoothness of the handle where 10,000 previous swings had polished the wood and set a log on the block. She swung. The axe connected with the grain and the cedar opened along its natural line, and the 2 pieces separated and fell to the sides, and the air came off the cut surface, carrying its cold green smell, and there was, in that moment, no gap between the person swinging and the swing itself. No waiting. No arrangement of this moment toward the next one. No Toku watching Toku split wood. Just the axe. Just the log. Just the clean split and the cold and the smell of cedar in the morning. She stood with it for a moment, not thinking about it, which would have been the wrong direction, simply allowing the body to register what the body already knew. Then she set another log on the block. She split wood for an hour. The cold worked its way into her fingers, and she let it. The pile of split pieces grew, and the unsplit stack diminished, and the kitchen would have fuel for the afternoon and evening fires. And this mattered. And the splitting itself also mattered. Separately, and without requiring the fuel to justify it. In the afternoon sitting, she did not wait for anything. This was not a decision she made. It was simply what happened when she sat, and the bell had rung, and she was there with her breath and the pale light through the narrow window, and the cold boards, and the faint sound of the wind working through the cedars outside. Nothing opened. Nothing broke through. The bell rang at the end, and she rose, and the evening continued. And she was, in every verifiable way, exactly who she had been when she sat down. And this was, she understood now, with the part of her that was below understanding, this was already exactly, completely, everything. She stayed at the hermitage through 3 more winters. By the time she left, she had stopped looking for the arrival, which meant she had been arriving, continuously and without interruption. Since the first morning she had walked through the cedar gate with cold in her shoulders and straw in her sandals, and the particular wrong-headed conviction that the important thing was not yet here. It had been here the whole time. It was always only here. The teaching from this story settles into the listening body like warmth. Dogen Zenyi, the founder of Soto Zen in Japan, offered a teaching so simple that it has occupied practitioners for 8 centuries without being fully received, and so quietly radical that it upends every assumption we carry about what practice is for. He said, practice and realization are not 2 separate things related by time. The sitting does not lead to awakening the way a road leads to a city. The sitting is already the expression of awakening. In each moment, it is genuinely, completely, undividedly done. We are a culture of preparation. We live slightly ahead of ourselves, almost always, arranging this moment as the corridor to the next one. The breathing practice becomes a method for a calmer life. The meditation becomes a technique toward a quieter mind. The effort toward presence becomes itself a future-oriented effort, a preparation for some arrival that keeps receding at exactly the pace we approach it. And the gap between where we are and where we imagine we should be becomes a form of permanent homesickness, a restlessness that has forgotten what it was originally looking for, searching for what was never anywhere but here. Dogen said, "Stop looking forward. Not forever. Not as a philosophy of passivity. Just in this moment. Just in this breath. The breath you are taking right now is not a step toward a calmer breath. It is already the calm, in this body, available right now, requiring nothing to be added and nothing to be waited for. Feel the weight of the body where it rests. That contact, the pressure of surface against surface, warmth against warmth, is already complete. It is not a preparation for comfort. It is comfort itself, happening without ceremony in this exact moment. The breath moves in. The breath moves out. This is not a technique. This is just what a breathing body does, and it has been doing it without you needing to arrange or improve it. Every moment of your entire life. Let the hands rest open. Let the jaw soften just slightly. Let the exhale be a little longer than the inhale, not because longer is better, but because the body often wishes to release a little more than habit allows. You are not waiting for the real rest to arrive. You are already in the only rest there is. Not later. Not after sufficient practice. Now, here, this breath, this body, this moment, already whole, already arrived, already, without any addition or subtraction, completely home. If you drift off now, that is perfect. You don't need to stay awake to carry this forward. The body already knows. Let it. And as that knowing softens from thought into something the muscles understand, as the breath slows of its own accord, we travel now to the high mountains of Tibet, where a young man has been walking for many days toward a cave where an old hermit teacher lives, and where he is about to discover that what he was seeking on that long walk was already present in the very act of walking it. Drawing from the Kagyu tradition of Tibet, inspired by the lineage of seekers who walked weeks across high mountain passes to find hermit masters, and what those masters revealed about the nature of the search itself, consider this story of a young man named Tenzin, who traveled a very long way to find refuge, and discovered it had been walking with him the entire time. The plateau of central Tibet in late autumn is a landscape that has stripped itself of pretense. What remains is essential: sky, rock, wind, and the particular quality of light that exists only at great altitude. Where the atmosphere is thin enough that color arrives more directly, the blue of the sky, a blue that exists nowhere closer to the earth. The gold of dying grass, a gold that has nothing left to soften it. The passes between valleys are not gentle here. They rise steeply through terrain where no tree grows, where the wind works without obstruction, where the cold, even in the daytime, has a quality of intention, not malicious, but utterly indifferent to whether you cross or don't. Tenzin had been walking for 11 days. He was 24 years old, the third son of a barley farmer in a village 2 days east of Shigatse, and he had the kind of face that work outdoors produces weathered beyond its years. The skin around the eyes permanently creased from squinting against wind and altitude glare. He had spent 4 of his childhood years studying with the monks at the local monastery before his father's illness recalled him to the land, and those 4 years had lodged inside him like a stone that would not dissolve, something angular and persistent that made the ordinary life of the farm feel insufficient without his being able to name precisely what it lacked. He carried a worn wool tuba secured at the waist with a yak hair rope, a leather satchel with sampa flour, dried cheese, and a small bag of butter tea leaves, a copper bowl, and a thin blanket. He also carried, folded carefully inside the inner pocket of his tuba, a letter from the abbot of the Shigatse monastery addressed to a hermit teacher named Urgen, who was said to live in a cave at the base of a cliff face known locally as the White Throat, 3 days' walk north of a particular valley that Tenzin was still 2 days from reaching. He had been told about Urgen by the abbot after months of asking questions that the abbot grew tired of answering. The questions were always variations of the same question, circling something Tenzin could not articulate precisely. How does a person find rest, not the rest of sleep, which Tenzin had no trouble with, not the rest of a body that has finished its labor for the day. The rest, he meant, was something else, an interior settling, a quality of being at home inside one's own existence that he observed. Occasionally, in the older monks, when they were unaware of being watched, a quality they never seemed to be performing or achieving. It was simply there, or it wasn't. And when it was there, it made the person carrying it appear fundamentally different from people who didn't have it. In the way that a fire-warmed room is different from a cold one, even when nothing in the furniture has changed. The abbot had looked at him for a long time after the last of these attempts at articulation, then had gone to his writing box and composed the letter to Urgen. "He is not easy," the abbot had said, folding the letter with the unhurried precision of a man who believed in doing each thing properly. "But he is the right teacher for this particular question." Tenzin had asked what made his question particular. "You are not asking how to practice," the abbot said. "You are asking how to rest. Those are different journeys." The wind on the 11th day came from the northwest and had the raw edge of the snow country in it, carrying fine crystals of ice that struck the exposed skin of Tenzin's cheeks and forehead with a sensation between sting and burn. He walked with his chin tucked and his eyes narrowed, watching the path only a few steps ahead. The path here was barely a path, a depression in the plateau grass, lighter in color than the surrounding growth, that became visible only when viewed from a certain angle. It appeared and disappeared as the terrain shifted. He followed it with the focused attention of a person who understood that losing it would mean real difficulty. In this quality of walking, he noticed something. The cold was present. The wind was present. The discomfort of his feet, which had developed 2 blisters on the left heel on the 4th day that had since hardened into something more bearable, was present. The weight of the satchel pulling at his shoulder was present. And all of this discomfort and cold and effortful attention to the next few steps of the path was somehow not the suffering he had expected. Or rather, it was discomfort, straightforwardly, without the additional layer of complaint that he noticed was usually present when he was uncomfortable at home. There was no one to tell about it. No possibility of stopping until there was somewhere to stop. And so the cold was simply cold. The wind was simply wind. And he walked inside it with a quality of presence that he did not have a name for yet. But that felt, faintly and unexpectedly, like something close to what he had left home to find. He did not know what to do with this observation. He filed it away and kept walking. He reached the valley on the afternoon of the 13th day, and the cave at the base of the White Throat Cliff on the evening of the 14th, arriving as the light was draining from the western sky and the first stars were appearing at the zenith. Very bright at this altitude, very close. The cliff face rose steeply from the valley floor, pale grey-white limestone streaked with mineral deposits that gave it its name. And at its base, perhaps 15 meters up, a rough scramble of loose rock and scrubby juniper, was the dark opening of a cave before which a small fire burned in a stone ring. Tenzin climbed carefully, calling out as he went in the customary way of a visitor approaching a hermit's dwelling. "I come with a letter from Abbot Rinchen of Shigatse. I am looking for the teacher Urgen. I mean no disturbance to the practice." A voice from the cave. "Disturbance has nothing to do with it. Come and sit." Urgen was older than Tenzin had imagined, very old. Perhaps 70 years, though the cold had preserved him in the way it preserves certain things, and his eyes had the alert, unhurried quality of a person for whom time no longer pressed in the usual direction. He wore a patchwork tuba that had been repaired so many times in so many different colors of thread that the original color was no longer identifiable. He sat cross-legged beside the fire with a naturalness that made sitting appear not as a position chosen but as the natural condition of his body. What a body does when it has nowhere else to be. Tenzin presented the letter. Urgen held it toward the firelight and read it twice, then set it carefully to one side with the manner of a person who treats even paper with respect. "Sit," he said again. Tenzin sat. The fire was small but efficient, its heat radiating within a modest radius. And beyond that radius, the night was very cold and very quiet. From the cave mouth, the valley below was visible, the pale strip of a frozen stream, the dark mass of a few juniper stands, and above everything the stars multiplying as the sky darkened further. 14 days from Shigatse, Urgen said. Not a question. 11 from the monastery. I left 3 days before I went to Abbot Rinchen's. What did you do in those 3 days? Tenzin was quiet for a moment. I tried to decide whether to go. And what decided you? I kept thinking about a question I couldn't answer, and eventually I realized that staying at home wasn't helping me answer it. Urgen tilted his head slightly. In the firelight, his face was a landscape of deep lines and shadow, the face of a person who has spent decades sitting with things rather than solving them. Tell me the question. Tenzin told him what he had tried and failed to tell the abbot the thing he had seen in the older monks. The quality of settled presence that was not a performance. The interior rest that seemed to exist underneath whatever the person was doing, rather than as a separate thing added to it. The sense that such people were home in themselves in some way that he was not home in himself, and had not been, as far back as he could remember. Urgen listened without interruption. When Tenzin finished, the old hermit was quiet for a long time, long enough that Tenzin wondered if he had said something wrong, or if the silence was itself a response he was meant to understand. Then Urgen said, On the 11th day of your walk, there was a wind from the northwest. Tenzin looked at him. Yes. What were you doing? Walking, watching the path. It was hard to see. And where were you? Tenzin paused. It was a strange question with an obvious answer. And the obvious answer felt, in the moment of formulating it, somehow wrong, not incorrect, but insufficient. On the plateau, he said. Watching the path. Were you thinking about Shigatse? No. Were you thinking about this cave? No. I was watching for the path. It kept disappearing in the grass. Were you suffering? Tenzin took a breath. I was cold, he said slowly. My feet hurt. The wind was strong. But he stopped. He was arriving at the same observation he had made that day and filed away without knowing what to do with it. No, he said. Not in the way I expected. Urgen nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had known before asking. What was different? He said. There was nothing to do except walk, Tenzin said. There was no one to explain the cold to. No possibility of stopping. So the cold was just cold. Just cold. Urgen repeated. Not cold plus the complaint about cold. Not cold plus the wish to be somewhere warmer. Not cold plus the question of when it will end. Just cold. Yes. And in that just cold in the walking that was only walking, where were you resting? The question arrived in Tenzin's body before it arrived in his mind. He felt it somewhere in the chest, not as understanding, but as the specific sensation of something true, touching something that had been waiting for it. He did not answer immediately because the answer, when it came in a form that was not quite language. In the walking, he said finally. In the walking, Urgen said. Not behind the walking, waiting for the walking to end. Not ahead of the walking, anticipating the cave and the fire. In the walking itself, fully in it. And in that full being in it, there was no gap between you and where you were. No distance. No Tenzin who is here wishing to be Tenzin who is elsewhere. He paused. In the Kagyu teaching, we call the nature of mind luminous emptiness, Rigpa. The awareness that is both clear and open, that neither grasps nor rejects, that is simply present with what is present. You touched it on the plateau. You touch it every time you are so fully in what you are doing that the one who is doing it disappears for a moment. I didn't recognize it, Tenzin said. I didn't know what it was. Of course not. You were looking for something that would feel like arriving somewhere you had never been. But Rigpa is not a new place. It is the nature of every moment you have ever been fully in. It was present on the plateau. It was present when you were a child watching the monks. It was present. This is the difficult part. It is present right now. Underneath this conversation, underneath the fire, underneath your cold feet and your question. Urgen looked at him directly. The quality you saw in the older monks is not something they acquired. It is something they stopped covering up. The fire shifted and settled, sending a brief increase of light across the cave mouth and then diminishing again. An ember cracked. Beyond the fire, the plateau valley lay in its deep winter darkness, ancient and indifferent and beautiful. But how does one stop covering it? Tenzin asked. Urgen was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a person choosing words that had been used before but were being chosen freshly. Because they must be. You stop covering it the same way you stop covering it on the plateau, he said. By having no choice but to be where you are. But on the plateau, the circumstances removed the choice for you: the cold, the wind, the path that kept disappearing. Here, the circumstances are comfortable enough that the mind immediately begins to travel. It goes to Shigatse. It goes to what you will do tomorrow. It goes to the question of whether you have understood correctly. He paused. The practice, and there is practice. Do not think I am telling you the journey is already done, is learning to choose what the plateau imposed. To arrive, voluntarily, in the full fact of this moment. Not because you have suppressed the traveling mind, but because you have become genuinely interested in this. He gestured, a small movement that seemed to encompass the fire, the cave, the valley, Tenzin himself. All of this, right now, which is, always, the only thing actually happening. Tenzin stayed with Urgen through the winter. He slept on a mat near the cave entrance and learned the old man's daily pattern: before dawn, sitting in the dark, work through the morning, gathering what the plateau provided and maintaining the cave. Afternoon sitting, and the long evenings by the small fire, during which Urgen sometimes spoke and sometimes was silent, and the distinction between speaking and silence felt less significant as the weeks passed. Urgen gave him formal instruction in the Kagyu practice of Mahamudra, how to rest the mind without forcing it, how to notice awareness without grabbing at it, how to allow thoughts to arise and dissolve without following them into their destinations. But the instructions always returned to the same pointing. The thing being cultivated was not new. It was the natural condition of a mind that had stopped traveling. One morning in what he calculated to be late winter, Tenzin was carrying water from the frozen stream below the cliff, the ice broken at the same place every morning. The bucket filled and carried back up the loose rock scramble with careful feet, and he noticed that he was doing only that. The cold of the bucket handle through his gloves, the steam that rose briefly from the broken ice and dissolved, the particular sound his footsteps made on frozen scree, different from the sound on loose, dry rock. And underneath all of it, steady and unlocated, the simple fact of awareness, here, noticing, open, not grasping and not pushing away. He stood at the base of the cliff for a moment. The sky above was the color it was at this hour in winter, a deep, luminous blue-gray that would warm to clarity as the sun rose above the eastern ridge. A pair of lammergeier circled high above the valley, their wingspan enormous from this distance, hanging in the cold air with the easy quality of something that has made a complete peace with where it is. He thought of the plateau, the 11th day, the northwest wind, the path disappearing in the grass, the cold that was just cold, the walking that was only walking. He had been home then, not knowing it home in the same way the birds were home in the air, not because the air was comfortable, but because it was where they were, fully, without reservation. He picked up the bucket and carried the water up to where Urgen sat, waiting beside the cold hearth, entirely present, as if he had nowhere else to be. Which was the truth. The teaching that lives in this story rests quietly in the chest. Beneath all the words, the most exhausting search any of us undertakes is the search for rest. We look for it in the right circumstances, the vacation we have planned, the evening we have cleared, the moment when the responsibilities finally thin enough that we can breathe. We look for it in accomplishment, believing that once enough has been done, once enough has been arranged and secured and resolved, something in us will settle and we will finally be home in ourselves. We look for it in understanding, as Tenzin looked for it, believing that if we could only find the right teaching, hear the right words, recognize what the calm monks carry in their chests, we would know how to have it. And all of this looking carries us away from the only place where rest has ever existed, or ever could. The Kagyu teachers call it by many names: Rigpa, ordinary mind; luminous emptiness, the nature of mind. But what these names point to is not a special state. It is this moment, with all its ordinary texture, the temperature of the air on the skin, the weight of the body where it rests, the sounds that arrive without announcement and dissolve without requiring anything. When you are so fully in this moment that you and the moment are not separate, when there is no Tenzin watching the walking, but only the walking that is it. That is what the monks carry. Not a special thing they accumulated. The simple, the startling fact of being entirely here. Right now, there is this. The breath moving in, the breath moving out. The weight of what holds you. The sounds of wherever you are, near and far, familiar and strange. None of it requires you to go anywhere. None of it requires you to understand it first before it can offer what it offers. Let the breath move in. Let it move out. Feel the contact between body and surface, the warmth gathering there, the specific texture of what holds you. You have been carrying this all along. You carried it on every difficult day. In every moment, you were so fully occupied with what was in front of you that the traveler inside went quiet. In those moments you were home. You have always been capable of this. You don't need to stay awake to receive it. Let the body know. The body already knows. In, out. The weight of you, resting. Exactly here. And as that recognition settles not as a thought, but as something the body understands without needing to name it, we travel now to the mountains of Korea, where an old woman is about to teach her granddaughter something about the light that was never lost, and a golden Buddha that no one could find because it was already closer than any of them knew. In the spirit of Korean Seon Buddhism, inspired by Seon Master Daeheng Kunsunim's teaching that every person, regardless of learning or station, is already endowed with the full wisdom and abilities of all Buddhas, and drawing from the tradition of lay people, carrying the practice in their hearts through ordinary daily life. Consider this story of a young woman named Soyeon, and the grandmother who taught her where the golden Buddha had been all along. The village of Okcheon sat in a valley between two ridges of the Sobek Mountains, a village small enough that its name appeared on no official map of the Joseon kingdom, but large enough to have a well, a ginkgo tree taller than any building, and a reputation for the quality of its white porcelain clay, which was taken from the hillside above the village and formed into jars and rice bowls that found their way, through a chain of small trades, as far as the markets of Jeonju. It was a commoner's village, Sangmin country, the domain of farmers and potters and weavers, and the Buddhist temple that sat a half-hour's walk up the ridge behind it. Cheongsamsa was the kind of modest mountain temple that had survived the Joseon dynasty's hostility to Buddhism by being too small and too remote to be worth the trouble of suppressing. The temple had 3 monks and, in the early years of the 18th century, a cook who was not a monk at all but a village woman named Grandmother Wulsim, who had been preparing the temple's meals for 11 years and who slept in a room next to the kitchen and walked down to the village on the 1st and 15th of each month to visit her granddaughter. Her granddaughter was named Soyeon. She was 19 years old and worked at the family loom, weaving the plain hemp cloth that her mother dyed and her father sold at the Jeonju market every 3rd month. Soyeon was skilled at the loom. Her hands had learned the rhythm of the shuttle by the time she was 12, and by now she wove without needing to think about it, her body carrying the pattern while her mind roamed wherever it wished. This was one of the pleasures and one of the difficulties of the work. It left the thinking mind very free, and Soyeon's thinking mind left free. tended to run in circles around the same cluster of worries. The younger brother whose cough had persisted through 2 winters, and the 3rd winter was now arriving. The family's debt to the grain merchant in the next village, which had not shrunk in 3 years, her own marriage prospects, which her mother discussed with an urgency that increased with each season, and which Soyeon found she could neither dismiss nor properly consider without something in her chest tightening to the point where she had to set the shuttle down and go outside and stand in the air for a while. On the afternoon of the first day of the 10th month, Grandmother Wulam came down the ridge path, carrying a bundle of persimmons from the tree behind the temple kitchen and a clay jar of fermented, salted shrimp, and found Soyeon sitting on the wooden step outside the weaving room, with her eyes fixed on the middle distance and her hands entirely still in her lap. "You're not weaving," her grandmother observed. "The thread kept breaking," Soyeon said. Wulam sat down on the step beside her granddaughter, set her bundle to one side, and looked at the same middle distance Soyeon was looking at, which was the garden wall and the persimmon tree, whose leaves had turned deep red-orange in the first cold of autumn, more vivid than at any other time of year. She sat with the easy lack of ceremony of a person who has no need to fill silence. After a while she said, "What has you?" Soyeon told her. The cough, the debt, the marriage question she could not think about properly, the particular exhaustion of worrying about things she could not affect regardless of how much she worried about them, and yet not being able to stop. She spoke in the way people sometimes speak to grandmothers more completely than they speak to anyone else, the usual filters removed by the specific quality of being known for a very long time. Wulam listened to all of it without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her face unchanged. When Soyeon finished, her grandmother was quiet for a moment longer. "Has the worrying helped with any of it?" she asked. "No," Soyeon said. "The thread kept breaking. The loom stops. The worrying continues. The thread keeps breaking." Wulam paused. "What do you think is keeping the thread breaking?" Soyeon looked at her. "I think I'm pulling unevenly. When my mind goes somewhere else and comes back, my hands follow and there's a jerk in the tension. So the thread breaks when you're not here," Wulam said. "And when you are here, when the shuttle is only the shuttle and the warp is only the warp and there's nothing else, does the thread break then?" "No," Soyeon said slowly. "When I'm only weaving, I don't lose the tension. Then the loom already knows something that the worrying mind hasn't learned yet," her grandmother said. They sat for a while longer. A sparrow landed on the garden wall, considered something, and flew away. The persimmon tree's leaves moved slightly in the cold air coming down from the ridge. "Halmoni," Soyeon said, grandmother, the word carrying its particular warmth of diminutive affection when you first went to the temple. "Were you afraid?" Wulam tilted her head slightly, remembering. She had been 43 when she went to the temple, widowed for the 2nd year, her children grown and dispersed to their marriages and their own villages. The temple had needed a cook. She had needed, though she had not put it in these words at the time, somewhere to put herself. That was not the house where she kept expecting to hear her husband's cough and kept hearing silence instead. "I was something," she said. "Afraid is part of it. Lost is more of it. I had spent 23 years being one particular person, someone's wife, someone's mother, and then I was none of those things in the usual way, and I didn't know what was left." "And what was?" Soyeon asked. Her grandmother looked at her hands for a moment, the hands that had been making meals for 45 years, first in the family house and then in the temple kitchen. Hands that knew the weight of a cleaver and the feeling of dough and the temperature of oil by a quality of sensation that had nothing to do with thinking. She turned them over in her lap, examining them as one might examine something useful and familiar that has revealed an unexpected quality. "I found it in the kitchen," she said. "Not at the altar. Not during the chanting, though the chanting was good too. In the kitchen, chopping vegetables, or stirring the pot, or washing the stone bowls in the cold water from the well before dawn. There's a quality that comes when you're doing something that requires your full hands and your full attention and leaves no room for you to be somewhere else. The thinking mind goes quiet. And what's left, what's there, when the thinking mind goes quiet, that was what I found." "What was it?" Soyeon asked. Wulam was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who used elaborate language, and what she was attempting to describe was not a thing that elaborate language served particularly well. She had heard one of the monks, the young one, Monk Hyoksan, who had come down from a mountain temple with a reputation for learning, use various terms for it during the morning, chanting Jungong, the true master, Buddha nature, the inherent foundation. The terms pointed at the same thing she had found in the kitchen, but the terms were not the thing itself. The thing itself was simpler and stranger than any term. "It's hard to say what it is," she said finally. "It's easier to say what it isn't. It's not a feeling. Feelings come and go, joy comes and goes, grief comes and goes, worry comes and goes. This doesn't come and go. It's more like what the feelings appear in, like the room that is there, whether the lamp is lit or not. You don't notice the room when the lamp is bright, but when the lamp dims and the feeling passes and there's a moment of quiet, the room is there. It was there the whole time." Soyeon looked at her. "And you found this in the kitchen?" "I found it in the kitchen because the kitchen made me present enough to notice what was already there," Wulam said. "Not because the kitchen is special. The loom would do just as well." She looked at her granddaughter. "Did it not, when you said, when the shuttle is only the shuttle, and the warp is only the warp, and there's nothing else?" Soyeon understood then what her grandmother was pointing at. She understood it not as an idea she had understood it already. In the instant her grandmother said it, but in the way that understanding sometimes arrives later than the knowing, settling into the body a moment after the mind has received it. She felt it as a slight shift in something in the chest, the specific sensation of something true and close and already present being recognized. "You're saying I've already been there," she said. "Many times," Wulam said. "Every time you are only weaving." They sat together on the step until the light began to change. The late afternoon gold of autumn, going amber and then cooling toward dusk. Soyeon's mother called from inside the house about the evening meal. Wulam stood with the slight deliberateness of a person whose knees had reached the age where standing from low positions required attention, gathered her bundle of persimmons and the jar of shrimp paste, and set them inside the door. Before she left, she turned back to her granddaughter. "There was a woman in the village below our temple," she said. "This is something Monk Hyoksan told me, from his teacher's teaching, from the great Sion tradition. A woman who had kept a golden Buddha statue in her home all her life, very small, very worn, but precious to her. When she was old and her sight was going, she could no longer see it clearly on the altar shelf. She called her granddaughter and said, 'Where is the golden Buddha?' And the granddaughter looked all over the house. She looked on the altar shelf, it was there, but the grandmother could not see it. She looked in the storage room, behind the great jar. She looked in the outer hall. She went outside to see if it had been put in the garden. And all the while, the grandmother sat in the middle of the room, the golden Buddha directly in front of her on the shelf, perfectly present, exactly where it had always been." Soyeon waited. The granddaughter came back. Wulam said, Halmoni, it's right here. It's been here the whole time, right where you put it. She let the story rest for a moment. The way the teachers she had learned from let things rest, not explaining the explanation, trusting that what was true would find its way. We are all that granddaughter, she said, and we are all that grandmother, looking everywhere. And it is always right here, right where it has always been. Then she walked back up the ridge path toward the temple, her figure diminishing into the late afternoon shadows between the trees, becoming small and then part of the mountain. Soyeon sat on the step for a while longer. Then she went inside, sat down at the loom, picked up the shuttle, and wove. Just the shuttle, just the warp, just the tension, even and steady, the thread unbroken. She wove until the light was gone, and her mother brought the lamp. She did not think about the debt, or the marriage, or her brother's cough. Not because these things had resolved, they had not, but because for the length of that evening's weaving, they were not more real than the cloth growing under her hands. And the cloth was very real, and the hands were very real, and the rhythm of the loom was a rhythm she had known for 7 years, and had never, until this evening, understood was also a teaching. The thread did not break once. Her grandmother died the following spring, in the kitchen of the mountain temple, between the preparation of the morning gruel and the moment when it would have been ready to serve. One of the monks found her seated on the low stool she used when stirring the large pot, her hands in her lap, her face entirely composed. The young monk Hyoksan said, afterward, that he had seen many deaths in his years of practice, and this one had a particular quality to it, not an ending. Exactly, but more like someone stepping from one room into another, easy and complete, as if they knew both rooms very well and had never, in truth, been in only one. Soyeon went up to the temple for the ceremony and walked home alone down the ridge path in the late afternoon, through the same cold mountain air her grandmother had walked through twice a month for 11 years. She was 20 years old. The debt was still there. Her brother's cough was better. Actually, the third winter had been mild. The marriage question would resolve itself in its own time, or it would not. She walked through the mountain cold, and the mountain cold was just cold, and she was just walking, and her grandmother was everywhere in the cedar smell, in the quality of the light through the ridge trees, in the weight of her own footsteps on the path, not as a feeling of loss, which would come later and be real and be appropriate, but as something prior to the loss, something that loss had not touched and could not, something she could not name but recognize completely. The golden Buddha, right here, right where it had always been. The teaching from this story descends gently, the way the right teaching always does, not forcing, not demanding to be received, simply present, like a hand resting open. Seon Master Daehang taught that every person alive is already endowed with everything, the full wisdom, the full capacity, the complete light that we call by many names and search for in many places. Not as a future possibility, not as a distant potential waiting to be earned. Already, completely, right now, within the very mind that is reading and hearing these words. This is not poetry. It is the central observation of the Korean Seon teaching, Jungong, the true master. The inherent foundation is not outside. It never was. The search has always been the only obstacle. And yet we search. We search in the next accomplishment, in the resolved problem, in the moment when the difficulty finally ends and the ease we believe we deserve will finally begin. We search in the right practice, the right teacher, the right understanding. We look on every shelf in the house. We check the storage room. We go out to the garden. And all the while, what we are looking for sits precisely where it has always sat, in the center of the room, unmoved, unhidden, waiting for nothing. The grandmother found it in the kitchen. The granddaughter found it in the loom. You may find it, you have found it, many times, without calling it by name, in whatever requires your full presence. The morning commute, when traffic finally clears and there is only the road. The conversation that becomes so genuine that you forget to manage how you're coming across. The task that absorbs you so completely that when you emerge, you are surprised by how much time has passed. Because you were not watching time, you were here, fully. And here is where the foundation lives. It does not leave when you stop noticing it. It does not depend on your recognition to remain. The room is there whether the lamp is bright or dim. It was there through every difficult day. It was there through every moment you believed it was absent. It is there, right now. Underneath these words, underneath the breath, underneath whatever the mind is doing with this moment. Let the shoulders soften. Let the jaw unclench just slightly. Let the breath complete itself in and out, and the small pause at the end that the body knows without being instructed. In that pause, nothing is missing. Nothing needs to be added. The Golden Buddha is right here, right where it has always been, right where it will always be. If you drift to sleep now, it comes with you. You cannot leave it behind. You cannot lose it. You only forget, sometimes, to look where it actually is. And as that forgetting softens into something gentler, as the mind begins to release its list of where the treasure might be hidden, we come now to a different stillness, a different listening. We arrive at the Pali Canon, at a teaching so brief and so complete that the Buddha gave it in a single breath on a riverbank, to a man who had no time left for anything but the essential. A teaching about what it means to be home in awareness itself. From the Pali Canon, preserved in the Udana, one of the oldest collections of Buddhist scripture, comes the verified historical account of Baha Daruchirya, a man whose life shattered and reformed into something unexpected on the beaches of Suparaka, and whose awakening occurred in a street. In the middle of an ordinary morning, while the Buddha was walking to collect alms. The teaching the Buddha gave him lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It remains, 25 centuries later, among the most complete instructions ever given on the nature of refuge in awareness itself. The port of Suparaka, on the western coast of India, was the kind of city that a person could arrive in and disappear into very easily, which was part of what made it useful to those who needed to disappear. It sat at the convergence of caravan routes from the interior and sea lanes from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Far Eastern islands, and its harbor on busy mornings was a dense confusion of goods, sandalwood and ivory from the south, cotton and spices from the interior valleys, copper and glass from across the western sea, all of it moving through the narrow lanes of the wharf district under the shouting direction of merchants and the quiet labor of dock workers who had learned to become invisible inside the noise. Baha had known this port for most of his working life. He was a merchant from the river country, born in a family of traders who moved goods along the Indus routes. And by the time he was 30, he had crossed the Western Ocean 7 times and returned safely each time, which was not a small thing. The sea between the Indian coast and the far ports was genuinely dangerous, and the rate at which good ships failed to return was high enough that every successful voyage was understood by those who knew the trade to be partly skill, partly judgment, and partly the simple, arbitrary mercy of conditions that no human skill could fully control. He had a gift for the sea. He knew how to read weather by the quality of light on the horizon 4 hours before the storm arrived. He knew how to manage a frightened crew without hardening into cruelty. He knew which routes were reliable at which seasons, and which seasonal windows were not windows at all, but illusions created by the first calm days of a transitional weather pattern that could turn within 2 days into something capable of driving a ship sideways off its course for a week. He was, by the standards of his profession and his era, genuinely competent. This had made him comfortable. Comfort had made him, over the course of many voyages and many safe returns, quietly certain of things he was not, in fact, certain of at all. On the 8th voyage, the ship had gone off course 3 days out from the last provisioning stop. The storm came from the northwest, which was not the direction the sky had suggested it would come from, arriving in the night without the hours of warning that Baha's experience had taught him to read. By the time the crew understood what they were in, the sea had already made several decisions on their behalf. The ship held longer than it had any reasonable cause to hold. Then it did not hold. He came to consciousness on a beach he did not recognize, lying on sand that smelled of salt and rotting kelp, with his face pressed against a surface of small, smooth stones, still warm from the previous day's sun, even in the early morning. He was alive. He was alone. Of the others on the ship, he could see no sign in either direction along the beach. He lay on the stones for a while, taking inventory of what remained. The inventory was brief. He had a body that was intact, bruised, abraded, exhausted, but structurally whole. He had the knowledge in his body of how to sail, which was no longer useful. He had the knowledge in his mind of the trade routes, the seasonal weather patterns, the customs of the ports he had dealt in for 15 years, which was also, at this moment, no longer useful. He had nothing else. He walked to the edge of the tree line above the beach, found the inner bark of a particular fig tree flexible enough to be shaped into a rough garment, tied it around himself with a twisted vine, fashioned a kind of bowl from a large leaf folded and pinned with thorns, and walked in the direction he calculated Suparaka must lie. He arrived at the port city 2 days later, gaunt and sea salt roughened, and wearing a garment that no one in the city had ever seen the like of. He walked into the market district to beg for food, and the people he encountered saw in him what they were prepared to see, a man in extreme austerity, which, in their understanding, indicated either madness or holiness, and he did not appear mad. They gave him food. They gave him more food the next day. Within a week, people were bringing him questions. This was the part Baha had not anticipated and did not know how to navigate. He was a merchant, not a teacher. He had no teachings. He had only his shipwreck and his bark garment and his survival, which people seemed to find significant in a way that he could not entirely understand, but that he also, slowly and with a discomfort he tried not to examine too closely, stopped resisting. The food was reliable. The shelter was sufficient. And there was, he noticed, a quality of stillness that had come over him since the wreck, not peace. Exactly. More like the particular quiet of a person who has had everything stripped away and not yet rebuilt the interior furniture of their life. A quality that others apparently found restful to sit near. So he sat. People came. More questions arrived. He gave what he could, which was mostly silence and the particular quality of his presence. And people seemed to find this useful, and he let them. In the second year after the shipwreck, the belief that had been forming quietly in the back of his mind became something more definite. He believed he had understood something about the nature of experience that others had not understood. He could not articulate it precisely, but it felt true in the way that certain navigational judgments feel true before they can be proven by reference to any map. He believed, one who had arrived at something important. Perhaps one of those the teachers called arahants, the awakened ones. The thought came to him one evening while sitting alone, as it had come before, and this time it settled with particular comfort, like cargo properly stowed. He let it rest there. That night, a presence arrived in his awareness, something the tradition describes as a devata, a luminous being who had been his companion in a previous life. In the experience that followed, which was not a dream and not entirely waking, the presence spoke clearly. Baha, you are neither awakened nor on the path to awakening. You believe you have arrived. You have not. If you wish to meet one who has arrived, go north to Savati. There you will find the teacher called the Tatagata. Go without delay. Life is uncertain. He left Suparaka at first light. The journey from Suparaka to Savati was 120 leagues, a walk through heat and dust and the agricultural flatlands of the interior, through market towns and river crossings and the narrow roads between rice fields, where the walking was slow and the sun came directly from above without shadow. He stopped each night wherever nightfall found him and walked again at first light, and he permitted himself one night's rest at the midpoint of the journey, and no more. The urgency that had arrived with the Devata's words did not diminish as he walked. It clarified. He did not know what he would find in Savati, but he knew that the certainty he had been sitting inside for 2 years in Suparaka was not what he had believed it to be. And this knowledge was not comfortable, and discomfort in the direction of truth was, in his understanding, still better than comfort in the direction of error. He arrived at Savati in the early morning and found his way to the Jeta Grove Monastery, where a group of monks were doing walking meditation in the open air. He asked them where the teacher was. The monks told him, the Blessed One has gone into the city for the alms round. Baha left the grove at something between a walk and a run. He found the teacher in the lane between 2 market stalls, moving through the market district in the morning crowd with the quality of presence that Baha had noticed from a distance, and that struck him more completely as he drew close. The man moved through the noise and press of the market as if he were the stillest point in it, not apart from it, but somehow also not caught in it, the way a deep part of a river moves at a pace entirely independent of the surface turbulence. His eyes were open and receiving what was in front of them. His hands held the alms bowl with the same quality of attention that his feet placed themselves on the lane, each contact receiving its full due. Nothing held slightly in reserve for some other consideration. Baha fell to his knees in the lane, his head touching the dusty ground. "Teach me," he said. "Blessed One, teach me the Dhamma." The teacher did not stop walking. "This is not the right time. Baha, I am here for the alms round." The morning continued around them, 2 women arguing prices at a spice stall, a child moving through the crowd with a message clutched in his hand, a cow standing immovably in the lane, requiring everyone to root around her, the smell of the morning's cooking coming from the interiors of houses, the particular dusty warmth of a North Indian market morning already committed to its own direction. Baha rose from the ground and followed. "Blessed One," he said again, "it is hard to know who will die first, you or I. Please, teach me." The teacher continued walking. "This is not the right time, Baha." A third time, Baha asked. A third time he named the uncertainty. "It is hard to know for certain," he said. how long you will live, or how long I will live. Teach me, so that it will be for my good and happiness for a long time." The teacher stopped. He turned toward Baha and looked at him with eyes that had the particular quality Baha would remember for the rest of his life, not long. As it happened, the quality of being looked at by something that was entirely present with what it was looking at. Nothing withheld, nothing deflected. "In the scene," said the teacher, "let there be only the scene. In the heard, only the heard. In the sensed, only the sensed. In the cognized, only the cognized. Train yourself thus. When, for you, in the scene there is only the scene, there is no you in connection with that. When there is no you in connection with that, there is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor there, nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of suffering." Then he turned and continued walking, and the morning continued its business. And Baha stood in the lane with the teaching landing in him, the way the right thing sometimes lands, not as information to be stored and processed, but as something that goes directly to what it was always meant for, bypassing all the intermediate steps. In the scene, only the scene. He looked. A woman carried a clay water jar on her head. The jar was there. The woman was there. The light on the painted surface of the jar was there. He was looking. There was no Baha who is looking at the jar while also thinking about what looking at the jar means and what the teacher's words mean and whether he has understood correctly and what will happen next. There was only looking. Looking. Fully. And in that full, looking for the first time in his life, or for the first time he had been present enough to notice there was no gap, no distance, no Baha standing apart from the world, watching the world happen. The woman with the jar was exactly and entirely what was here, and he was exactly and entirely what was here. And here was not a location he was in, but simply what was complete, without addition, without anything missing. He stood in the lane for a moment that was, in the Theravada accounts, described as sufficient for the complete cessation of all the mental formations that constitute suffering. The traditional language says his mind was freed from the taints without grasping. The experiential content of this is not something language does well with. Something ceased. Something that had been producing a very faint but continuous sound, like the hum of a loom in a house one has lived in so long that one no longer hears, it simply stopped. And the quality of the world in that stopping was not different from the quality of the world a moment before, except that it was no longer being slightly muffled by the hum. He walked through Savati, just walking. The morning continued around him, the same morning, the same market, the same smell of cooking and animal and dust and blossom, the same woman with the jar, already around a corner and gone. It was ordinary. It was, just as the teacher had said, exactly what it was. No more, no less. And in that exactness, in that nothing added and nothing withheld, it was entirely, without qualification, enough. Later that morning, returning toward the grove, a cow with a young calf, startled by something in the lane, struck him and drove him to the ground, and he died there, in the dust of the morning street, between the alms round and the grove, in the middle of an ordinary day. The teacher, completing his round and returning through the same lane, saw his body lying where it had come to rest. He instructed the monks who were with him to carry it with care, to burn it with all proper respect, and to erect a reliquary over the ashes appropriate for one who has arrived completely. And in the assembly that evening, he said, Baha was foremost among those who comprehend instantly The body was in the dust. The comprehension was instantaneous. The morning had continued without noticing either. This teaching from the Pali Canon is one the listening body can receive directly, without the mind needing to process it first. It is that kind of teaching, not a thing to understand, but a thing to do. Right now. In this moment, right, in the herd, only the herd. The sounds that are present right now, near and far, familiar and strange, let them be exactly what they are. Not sounds that mean something, not sounds that need to be identified or evaluated or responded to. Just sound, arriving as it does, without asking permission. The traffic, if there is traffic. The silence, if there is silence. The breath, which is also sound, moving in and out with the unhurried regularity of something that has been doing this since before you were able to notice it. In the scene, only the scene, the darkness behind the closed eyelids, or the faint light that comes through just that. Not darkness that means sleep is coming or not coming. Not light that means the room is too bright or the hour is wrong. Just what is actually visible, received without commentary. Just what is there. In the sensed, only the sensed. The weight of the body against whatever holds it, the specific texture of warmth and contact. The way the body softens slightly into the surface over time as the muscles release what they were holding from the day. Not pleasant or unpleasant. Just present. Just exactly this sensation, happening right now. In this body, in this moment, that is the only moment there is. Baha asked 3 times for the teaching, because he was willing to ask 3 times, because he understood, before he understood anything else, that what he was asking for mattered more than his own comfort or his sense of appropriate timing. The asking itself was already a form of full presence. The urgency was already a form of arrival. You don't need to ask 3 times tonight. You only need to let the scene be only the scene, the herd be only the herd, the sensed be only the sensed. You only need to be, without addition or subtraction, exactly where you already are. In the body that breathes, in the bed or chair that holds you, in the room that is here, in the night that is here, in the moment that is, as it always has been, as it always will be, simply and completely this. There is no Baha who is falling asleep. There is only falling, which is already happening, which has been happening this whole time. Let it. In the herd, only the herd. In the sensed, only the sensed. In what arises, only what arises. And then less than that. And then less. Until there is nothing left to reduce. Because what remains is already everything, the ground before thought, the silence before sound, the home before any idea of home was needed. This, just this. And as that simplicity settles into the body, like the end of a long journey finally arriving, as the breath finds its own natural length, and the thinking mind grows quiet, without effort, we travel now to the banks of a river in Vietnam, where an old monk has returned to his home temple after many years, and where the monastery garden and the sound of water are about to teach him that he never truly left. In the spirit of Vietnamese Tien Buddhism, inspired by the teaching lineage of To Din Tu Hieu, the root temple, nestled in the pine-covered hills outside Hue, and drawing from the tradition of monks who carried their home within them through decades of exile. Consider this final story. It is a story not about arriving, but about the moment of discovering that the journey was never the distance between 2 places. Tay Min had been away from Tu Hieu for 41 years. He had left as a young monk of 32, crossing into exile on a vessel bound for Hong Kong with 17 other members of his community, carrying almost nothing: 2 robes, his lacquered eating bowl, a small wooden box containing the sutras he had copied by hand during his years as a novice, and sewn into the inner lining of his winter robe. As a kind of secret comfort, a single pine needle from the garden behind the meditation hall, dry and curved slightly, smelling still, faintly, of the resin that had kept it alive on its branch. He had not planned to keep the pine needle for 41 years. It had simply survived with him, moving from exile center to exile center, from Hong Kong to Thailand, to a small Vietnamese community in the hills above Lyon, France, where he had spent the longest portion of his years teaching in a converted stone farmhouse that smelled of damp and lavender rather than pine and incense, and where he had learned to make do with what was present rather than what he missed, which is a different skill from not missing it. He was 73 when the letter came. The new abbot of Tu Hiu, a man younger than the novices Min had known in his last year at the temple, wrote in careful formal Vietnamese that the community was healing, that practitioners were gathering again, that the old paths between the sleeping quarters and the meditation hall had been repaired, that the half-moon lotus pond before the main gate had been cleared of silt and the lotuses had returned. The abbot wrote that the pine trees were still there. He invited Min to come home. Min held the letter for a long time after reading it. He was sitting at the low table in his room at the Lion farmhouse, the window open to the French morning cool, bright, carrying the particular quality of early autumn light that has nothing to do with Vietnam and everything to do with the latitude of southern France. A beautiful light, familiar to him now after decades, but not his. He read the letter twice more, then set it down and looked at the light on the wall and felt the weight of 41 years moving through him in a way that had no name and did not need one. He left in late October, when the weather in Lyon had turned cold but had not yet hardened into winter. The flight from Paris to Da Nang was long, with a stop in a hub city where the airport corridor smelled of disinfectant and fried food in the way of international transit everywhere, making no particular claim to any country. He sat in a plastic chair and watched the other travelers move past, with the unhurried attention of a person who has learned that airports are good places for the practice of simply watching, not labeling what is watched. A child pulled a wheeled suitcase that was too large for her. A man in a business suit slept with his briefcase balanced on his knees and his neck bent at an angle that would cause discomfort when he woke. An old woman ate something wrapped in paper with the focused quality of a person eating alone who has decided to make an occasion of it. Min watched all of this and felt, faintly, the continuity of things. 41 years of watching people from a respectful distance, learning that the distance was not emptiness, but a kind of spaciousness. People moved through their lives as completely as this child moved through the airport, which was the only way possible. Da Nang, in the late afternoon, was warm in the way Vietnam is warm, not the theoretical warmth of a weather report, but a fullness of warm air that makes contact with the skin as a presence rather than an absence of cold. Dense with the particular humidity of a coastline and the specific compound of smells that his body recognized before his mind did, salt and diesel, and the sweetness of ripe fruit from somewhere nearby, and the mineral smell of the road after a brief rain that had stopped an hour before his arrival. He stood outside the arrivals hall and breathed it in and felt something in his chest that was not grief and not joy, but was located somewhere between them, in the region where the distinction between those things becomes less clear. The young monk who had come to meet him, a novice sent by the new abbot, perhaps 20 years old, with a round, serious face and newly shaved head, bowed and took his bag and led him to a small car. They drove north along the coast and then inland toward Hue, through the evening's lengthening shadows, through villages, where the smell of cooking entered the open window of the car, at regular intervals garlic and fish sauce, and the particular sweetness of caramelizing sugar that means someone somewhere is making a long-simmered dish. And Min sat in the back seat and watched Vietnam go past, outside the window, and did not try to hold or name or process what he felt. Because it was too large for any of those operations, and the car was moving through it anyway, and he was here, and it was here, and nothing was required of either of them except this. They arrived at Tu Hiu in the early evening. The triple gate appeared at the end of the winding pine-shaded lane, exactly as it had appeared for the 7 years he had lived inside it and the 41 years he had carried it in memory, which meant it appeared exactly as it was, roof curves dark against the sky, the 2 upper windows glowing with warm interior light. The gate open as it always was between the morning and evening services. He stepped out of the car before the novice had fully stopped, and stood in the lane and looked at the gate. He did not hurry. He had not hurried through an airport across 2 continents and a night of thin sleep to hurry the last 20 meters. He stood in the lane and let his eyes receive the gate and let his ears receive the sounds, the bell from somewhere in the interior marking the evening service hour. A single sustained note that moved through the pine trees and softened as it traveled and arrived at his ears, already changed by the distance, carrying the echo of the wood it had passed through. The pines around the lane were the same pines, or their successors, standing at the same angles to the path, making the same quality of shade at this hour when the light came low and horizontal through the spaces between the trunks. He walked through the gate. The half-moon pond lay just inside. As the abbot's letter had described, the lotuses floating on the dark water, their white flowers already closed for the evening, their round leaves holding small pools of water that caught the last skylight and held it. Fish moved beneath the surface in that unhurried way of fish in still water, visible as darker shapes within darkness. The reflection of the meditation hall lay across the water, slightly wavering, more intimate, somehow, than the hall itself, the water's version of the building, patient and present. He stood at the edge of the pond for a long time. He had dreamed of this pond during the first years of exile, when the mind, deprived of what it loves, insists on reconstructing it in sleep. The pond in his dreams had been exactly this pond, and also never quite this pond, too bright or too still. The lotuses in the wrong stage of bloom. The reflection sharper than water ever holds a reflection. The dreams had been a kind of longing in the form of images, and like all longing they had produced a version of the thing they missed that was more vivid and less real than the thing itself. Because longing always adds a quality that the actual presence of things never quite has, which is the quality of being absent. This pond before him now was not like the pond in his dreams. It was less vivid and more present. The smell of it was something the dreams had never gotten right, the particular green cool mud smell of a lotus pond in the evening, the way the surface releases a slight warmth into the cooler air of dusk, carrying with it the breath of the water and the earth beneath. His feet on the stone path around the pond made the sound of feet on stone, which is a sound that exists only in the actual world and never in the reconstructed one. He understood, standing there, something he had perhaps known for a long time and not quite assembled into a form he could hold. The exile had been real, and the return was real, and neither of them was the thing that mattered most. What mattered most was this, the standing here, the pond before him, the fish in the water, the bell still resonating somewhere in the wooden structures of the hall, his breath moving in and out in the evening air of Hue, the pine smell from the dark trees surrounding the grounds. This moment, which was completely itself, which required nothing from the past 41 years and nothing from whatever would come next. This moment, which had been available in some form in Lyon, in the airport, in the car on the coast road, every moment of those 41 years, waiting not to be found, but to be inhabited. He reached into the inner lining of his winter robe, the same robe he had carried from here to Hong Kong, to Thailand, to France, and now back again, and withdrew the small paper fold he had kept the pine needle in for decades. He opened it carefully. The needle was still there, dry, curved. The resin smell so faint now as to be almost imagined, but still present. The way certain things remain present, past all reasonable expectation. He looked at it for a moment. Then he walked to the edge of the pond and placed it on the surface of the water, gently, and watched it float. It turned slowly on the water's surface, catching the last light. He watched until the light was gone and the needle was only a small dark shape on darker water. Then he sat down on the stone bench beside the pond, the stone cold through his robe. He's solid, entirely real, and listened to the bell mark, the completion of the evening service, and to the sound of monks moving through the interior corridors toward the dining hall, the soft percussion of sandals on wooden floors, the quiet exchange of practical words about ordinary things. He listened to the pine trees receiving the night wind that moved through them from the hills above. The sound each cluster of needles made, not quite the same as any other cluster. The wind finding a different note in each passage through different density of growth. He was home. He had been home the whole time, in the way that the pond is still a pond in winter when it cannot be seen from the path. The form had changed. The being had not. He breathed in. He breathed out. The night deepened around Tu Hill, around the pine trees, and the lotus pond, and the sleeping hall, and the meditation hall, and the old stone paths repaired back to wholeness, and he sat on the bench and allowed the night to do what night does, which is to let everything soften into its essential form, the edges of things growing less distinct, the boundaries between one thing and another becoming something less insistent. There was the bench. There was the pond. There was the cool air on his face. There was the breath. There was nothing to resolve, and nothing to arrive at. And 41 years that had led exactly here, to this bench beside this water, beneath these trees, in this night that was just this night, neither remarkable nor unremarkable, simply present in the way that everything finally is when we stop asking it to be otherwise. He closed his eyes. The water moved slightly in the dark, carrying its reflection of nothing but the stars. And now, these words dissolve. The stories we have traveled through together tonight, across Vietnam and Korea and Tibet and Japan and China and ancient India, all of them pointing, in their different languages and centuries, at the same essential thing. Not a truth to be understood, but a ground to be rested in. You have been sitting with these stories, or lying with them, or letting them pass through you as you drifted between waking and sleep. Perhaps you remember some of them. Perhaps others have already dissolved into something softer than memory. Both are perfect. The stories were never the point. They were always only fingers, pointing. The point is here. The breath moving in your body right now, this specific breath, in this specific body, in this moment that will never be any other moment than this one. Let the shoulders release whatever they have been holding. Let the jaw soften. Let the hands open, palms upward or downward, whichever feels more like rest. You have traveled far tonight, through many centuries, across many traditions, in the company of seekers who found each in their own way, each in their own ordinary moment, that what they were looking for had not required the journey, had been present at the beginning of the journey, would be present at the end. The journey was not wasted. Nothing is wasted. The seeking itself is how we come to recognize what was never lost. You are home. Not after arriving here. Not because the conditions are right, or the mind is quiet, or the body has let go enough. You are home because home is what you have always been made of, the breath and the body and the awareness that holds both of them. The simple fact of being here, which no distance can diminish and no exile can touch. Let whatever remains of thinking tonight begin to thin. The way mist thins over still water as the temperature equalizes. Let the body choose sleep. It already knows how. In the scene, only the seen. In the herd, only the herd. In the felt, only the felt. This blanket, this weight, this breath, just this, just this, just this. Tonight you have traveled far. You have walked the dusty roads of ancient India with a merchant who lost everything in a shipwreck and found, in that loss, the beginning of something he could not yet name. You have stood in the pine-scented courtyard of a Vietnamese temple with an old monk who returned after 41 years to discover that what he had been carrying home was already home. You have sat with a Korean grandmother in a mountain village, learning that the golden thing we search for has never left the room. You have climbed a Tibetan plateau in thin air and biting wind, learning that presence is not a destination but a quality of moving. You have watched a Japanese monk sit on a cold wooden floor and let the sitting itself become the answer. You have followed a Chinese scholar through palace gardens and open country until he understood that what he was looking for could not be improved upon by any pavilion, however beautiful. You have sat with a Korean hermit on a ridge above autumn fog, learning to ask the question that has no answer and rest in that asking. You have walked with a Vietnamese woman through the grief of a father's silence until she found, in the middle of ordinary life, the thing that does not move. All of these lives, all of these different paths through the same territory. The same thing was waiting at the end of each of them. Not wisdom as something acquired, not peace as something achieved, but the simple recognition arriving differently in each tradition, in each century, in each specific human life, that what you are looking for, you are looking with. Awareness itself is the refuge. The breath itself is the home. This moment, received fully, without the addition of what you wish it were or the subtraction of what you wish it weren't, is the complete teaching. You don't have to remember any of this tomorrow. Understanding that sinks below thought works better than understanding held above it. Let whatever was useful go wherever it needs to go, into the body, into the breath, into the sleep that is already gathering at the edges of this moment. If these stories offered any companionship tonight in the dark hours, in the restless mind, in the familiar weight of the day that you carried here, then they have done what they came to do. If you are still awake, let these words be the last thing you follow. If you have already drifted, then you have understood more than words can reach. Rest well. You are home. Good night.